had always been the type of person who loved the outdoors. There was something calming about the woods, the smell of pine trees in the air, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, and the peace that came with being far away from the rush of city life. My friends and I had spent many weekends camping, hiking, and getting lost in nature. But one particular trip would change everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. It started on a Friday afternoon, with me and two of my close friends, Jake and Brian, preparing for a weekend camping trip in a remote area in the mountains. We had chosen a spot that was far off the beaten path, a place I had been to once before and remembered for its isolation and beauty. It was a spot where you could set up camp without the noise of other hikers or campers. The kind of place that felt like it was all your own. We packed up our gear, tents, sleeping bags, a portable stove, food, and enough firewood to last us the weekend. We weren't planning on anything fancy, just the basics. It was going to be a peaceful weekend of hiking, fishing, and telling stories by the campfire at night. There was no rush, no deadlines, just three guys alone in the wilderness. The drive was long. We drove through winding mountain roads, past small towns, and deeper into the forested area where cell service was practically non-existent. Eventually, we reached the end of the road, where a small dirt trail began. From there, it was a hike of about 5 miles to the campsite. The trail was narrow, shaded by thick trees, and the air smelled of earth and fresh pine. It was quiet, except for the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement, the kind of excitement you get when you know you're heading toward an adventure. But something else, a strange feeling I couldn't quite place, lingered in the back of my mind. It was nothing I could identify, just a quiet, nagging discomfort that made me glance over my shoulder every so often. But I brushed it off. It was nothing. After about 2 hours of hiking, we arrived at the campsite. The area was perfect, surrounded by tall trees, with a clear patch of ground for the tents. A small creek ran nearby, its water sparkling in the late afternoon sun. We set up camp quickly, unpacked our gear, and started a fire that as the evening wore on, we roasted marshmallows and talked about everything and nothing. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the cool night air. The stars above were brilliant, so bright, in fact, that it felt like we could reach out and touch them. Everything seemed perfect. There was no sign of anything that might make us uneasy. Around midnight, as the temperature dropped, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling snug and warm. The sounds of the forest outside, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees, lulled me into a peaceful sleep. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was a strange feeling, like I wasn't alone anymore. But I woke up in the middle of the night, wide awake and alert. The fire had long since died down, and everything outside the tent was eerily still. No animal sounds, no wind, not even the rustling of leaves. I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. Something was wrong. I had camped out in the wilderness countless times before, and I had never felt like this. I could feel my heart racing as I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the tent. The feeling of being watched was undeniable now. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek outside. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the campsite. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only a bed of glowing embers. Jake and Brian were still asleep, undisturbed by whatever was making me uneasy. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning the darkness, trying to figure out what was bothering me. Nothing seemed out of place. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The creek babbled softly in the distance. But that feeling, it lingered. Something wasn't right. I climbed back into my tent, trying to push the feeling aside and fall asleep again. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay there, staring into the darkness, my thoughts racing. What if there was something out there? Something watching us? The thought gnawed at me, growing more intense with each passing minute. The next morning, when I finally managed to drift off, I woke up to find the sun streaming through the trees. It was early, just as the light was beginning to break through the forest canopy. I groggily sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced over at Jake and Brian. They were both still fast asleep, their bodies sprawled out in the warmth of the early morning sun. I decided to go for a walk by the creek to clear my head. I grabbed my boots and headed out, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me the night before. The air was cool and crisp, and the forest was peaceful once again. I walked along the edge of the creek, listening to the sound of the water flowing over the rocks. The further I went, the more I began to feel like I was truly alone in this wild place. But as I rounded a bend in the creek, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died down completely. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Then, I noticed something strange. There, just off the trail, was a set of footprints in the soft dirt. They were fresh, too fresh. The prints were large, deeper than they should have been, as if someone or something had been walking through the area recently. I knelt down to examine them, my mind racing with questions. The tracks didn't belong to any animal I could identify. They weren't human either, but they were unmistakably close to human in shape, though they were much larger and had an odd, elongated appearance. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. I had no idea what these tracks belonged to, but I knew one thing for certain. We weren't alone. Something was out there with us, and it wasn't just a curious animal. I hurried back to camp, my thoughts racing. Jake and Brian were awake now, sitting by the fire, but I didn't mention the tracks. I didn't want to freak them out. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I knew we needed to stay alert. As the day went on, things seemed to get stranger. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and every little sound, every crack in the forest, made me jump. That night, as we sat around the campfire again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting. By the next morning, we were all on edge. The woods no longer felt like the peaceful retreat we had hoped for. Everything about the place seemed wrong, as if it had shifted overnight. The sounds of the forest were still there, but they were different somehow, more ominous, more oppressive. We decided to pack up and head back, but as we started to break down our tents, we heard something that made our blood run cold. A loud, crashing noise echoed through the trees. It was as if something large had just trampled through the underbrush. We froze, listening, our hearts racing. And then we heard it, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving through the woods toward us. We grabbed our bags and started running, not looking back. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whatever it was chasing us. We ran for what felt like miles, pushing ourselves harder than we ever had before. I could hear Jake and Brian behind me, breathing heavily, but I didn't dare slow down. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we burst out of the trees and onto the dirt road where we had parked our car. We didn't stop until we were inside the vehicle, doors locked, engines running. As we sped down the road, the sun began to rise behind us, casting long shadows across the forest we had just fled from. We didn't look back. We never spoke of that night again. But we all knew one thing. We had come too close to something we couldn't explain, something that was better left untouched. That forest was a place of solitude, yes, but it was also a place where things lurked just beyond the trees, waiting. And as we drove away, I couldn't help but feel that, somehow, we had just barely escaped. I've always enjoyed camping, There's something special about being outdoors, surrounded by nature, far away from the noise of the city. But this trip, the one I took last autumn, changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was a solo camping trip, something I'd done plenty of times before. I'd planned to spend 3 nights in a remote forest area that I'd read about online. The place wasn't a marked campsite, but more of a backcountry spot. It was supposed to be quiet, with beautiful views and a clear, starlit sky at night. Perfect for someone like me who wanted to escape the daily grind. I parked my car at the edge of the forest where the dirt road ended. The trail wasn't much of a trail, more like a faint path worn into the undergrowth by hikers or animals. I packed everything I needed: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for the trip, water, and a small stove. I also had a map, compass, and GPS. I wasn't about to get lost in the woods. The first day was uneventful, just the way I liked it. The trail took me deep into the forest, away from any signs of civilization. The trees stood tall, their leaves turning golden and red in the crisp autumn air. I walked for hours, only stopping to drink water or take short breaks. By late afternoon, I found a nice clearing next to a small stream. It was the perfect spot to set up camp. After pitching my tent, I gathered some wood and lit a small fire. The evening was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the fire, and watched the sun dip below the horizon. As darkness settled in, the forest around me came alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. I felt at ease. The first night passed without incident. I woke up refreshed and ready for another day of exploring. After a quick breakfast, I packed a small bag and decided to hike further into the woods. I didn't plan to stray too far from my campsite, just far enough to see more of the area. The forest was stunning in the daylight. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. I found a few interesting landmarks: a rocky outcrop with a breathtaking view, a grove of birch trees that stood out starkly among the evergreens, and an old, overgrown trail that seemed to lead nowhere. I returned to my campsite by mid-afternoon, feeling satisfied with my little adventure. The rest of the day was spent relaxing. I read a book, boiled some water for tea, and soaked in the serenity. The second night, however, was when things started to feel off. It began with small noises. As I lay in my tent, I heard faint sounds outside. Not the usual rustling of animals or the wind in the trees. This was different. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. But the sound persisted, circling my campsite. I held my breath, straining to hear more clearly. The steps would come closer, then move away, only to return again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but unease crept in. Gripping the flashlight I kept beside me, I finally decided to take a look. I unzipped the tent slowly and shone the beam of light outside. The forest was still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling that someone or something was watching me wouldn't go away. After a while, I climbed back into the tent, forcing myself to ignore the unease. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt near the stream, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked near the stream since setting up camp. The tracks were fresh, leading in and out of the clearing. Whoever had been there must have come during the night. I told myself it could have been another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone since starting my trip. The rational part of my mind tried to take over, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to stay put that day and keep close to camp. I didn't want to risk running into whoever had left those tracks. The day passed uneventfully, though I couldn't relax. Every little sound made me jump. As the sun set, I felt a growing sense of dread. I rebuilt the fire and kept it going longer than usual, hoping the light would deter anyone or anything from approaching. I ate a quick dinner and went to bed early, though I doubted I'd get much sleep. That night was worse than the last. The footsteps returned, louder this time. They didn't circle the campsite like before, but seemed to come straight toward my tent. My heart pounded as I lay there, clutching a knife I'd taken from my pack. The footsteps stopped just outside. I could hear breathing, slow and heavy. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they'd come, they left. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn broke, I emerged from the tent cautiously, scanning the area. More footprints surrounded the campsite, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could and started heading back toward my car. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me whip around, expecting to see someone following me. I kept a brisk pace, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming a few days ago, now felt oppressive. The towering trees and dense undergrowth seemed to close in around me, and the silence was deafening. By late afternoon, I reached the edge of the forest where I'd parked my car. Relief washed over me as I saw it sitting there, untouched. I threw my gear into the trunk and got in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, there was nothing. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. That night, I sat in my apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. I'll never know who or what was out there with me. Maybe it was a fellow camper playing a cruel prank. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never gone camping alone since. I've always loved being in the woods. There's something about the quiet hum of nature that calms me in a way nothing else can. So, when I had a week off from work, I decided to go on a solo camping trip. It wasn't my first time camping alone, and I felt confident in my ability to handle whatever came my way. I chose a spot deep in the forest, far from the marked trails and usual camping areas. I wanted solitude, no other people, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the forest's edge and shouldered my heavy pack. It was loaded with everything I thought I might need: a tent, a sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, a small hatchet, and other essentials. The hike to my chosen spot was about 6 miles. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but that was part of the charm. The deeper I went, the more alive the forest felt. Birds called out from the treetops, and squirrels darted across the path, chittering at me as I passed. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and earth that made me feel more awake with every step. I reached the campsite by mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a stream nearby for water. The ground was soft and covered in moss, perfect for setting up my tent. I spent the next hour setting up camp, pitching my tent, gathering firewood, and unpacking my gear. By the time I was done, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest. The chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only noises. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd been craving. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, letting the warmth seep into my skin as I stared at the flickering flames. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sound of the stream gurgling nearby. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, feeling refreshed and ready to explore. I spent the day hiking through the forest, following the stream as it wound its way through the trees. I found a few animal tracks in the mud near the water and even spotted a deer grazing in a meadow. The forest was alive and vibrant, and I felt completely at home. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set. I cooked another simple meal and settled in for the night. The second night was when things started to feel off. It began with a sound, faint at first but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, straining to hear over the crackling of the fire. The steps were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a bear, but the rhythm of the steps was too regular, too human. I stood up, my heart pounding. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and called out into the darkness, but there was no response. The footsteps stopped. For several long minutes, I stood there, staring into the trees, my ears straining for any sound. But the forest was silent now, unnaturally so. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been an animal startled by my voice. I sat back down by the fire, but the unease lingered. I stayed up later than usual, staring into the flames and glancing at the shadows beyond the firelight. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept the hatchet within arm's reach. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Just outside the clearing, in the dirt near the stream, were footprints. Human footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the clearing to the stream and back into the woods. They weren't mine. They were too large, and I hadn't been in that part of the clearing. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. Someone had been here, walking around my campsite while I slept. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper who had stumbled upon my site and left when they realized someone was already here. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the day close to camp, too uneasy to venture far. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. But the forest seemed empty. The footsteps from the night before felt like a bad dream. But the prints in the dirt were real, undeniable proof that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the light would keep whatever or whoever was out there at bay. I stayed up late again, clutching the hatchet and jumping at every sound. The forest seemed alive with noises. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. But nothing approached the clearing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I dozed off in my chair by the fire. I woke up sometime later to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were closer, circling the clearing. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I gripped the hatchet tightly and stood up, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I called out again, my voice trembling, but there was no response. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, feeding it more wood to keep it burning bright, and watched the trees. Nothing else happened, but the unease was overwhelming. To first light, I packed up my camp. I didn't want to spend another night in those woods. As I hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest was empty, or at least it seemed that way. When I finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. I loaded my gear as quickly as I could and climbed into the driver's seat. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, convinced I would see someone step out of the trees and onto the road. But there was nothing. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I've been camping alone many times before, but I've never experienced anything like that. I don't know who or what was out there, and maybe it's better that I don't. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I've always loved camping, but this trip was different from the start. I had taken the week off work to clear my head and decided to venture out to a national forest I'd never visited before. The place was remote with no cell service, and I was looking forward to the isolation, or so I thought. I reached the trailhead in the late morning. The parking lot was empty except for an old pickup truck with a camper shell, its paint faded and scratched. I didn't give it much thought as I loaded up my backpack and checked my gear one last time. My plan was to hike about 10 miles into the forest and set up camp near a lake I'd seen on the map. It looked secluded and peaceful, exactly what I needed. The trail was rugged but manageable, weaving through dense woods that smelled of pine and earth. The sunlight filtered through the trees, creating patterns on the ground. Felt good to be out there, away from emails and meetings. After about 2 hours of hiking, I stopped for a break. Sitting on a fallen log, I sipped water and ate a granola bar. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. As I continued, I noticed something odd. The trail seemed less maintained the farther I went. Overgrown bushes and fallen branches made it harder to navigate, but I pressed on, trusting my map and compass. Around mid-afternoon, I finally reached the lake. It was stunning, with clear water reflecting the surrounding trees. Not a single sign of another human. I set up my tent on a flat spot near the shore and gathered some wood for a small fire. By the time the sun started to set, I was feeling relaxed and accomplished. The first night passed uneventfully. The air was cool, and the stars were brighter than I'd ever seen. I fell asleep to the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. Leaving most of my gear behind, I followed the edge of the lake, taking in the sights and snapping a few pictures with my camera. It was around noon when I noticed something strange. On the opposite shore, where the trees were thicker, I saw what looked like a structure, maybe an old cabin. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The cabin was in terrible shape, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were shattered. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years, but there was something off about it. I couldn't put my finger on it. I stepped inside cautiously, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The interior was empty except for an old table and a chair, both covered in dust and cobwebs. On the table, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A recently opened can of food and a dirty fork. I backed out of the cabin quickly, my heart racing. Someone had been there recently, but where were they now? The forest had been completely silent since I arrived, and I hadn't seen any signs of people on the trail. I decided it was best to head back to my campsite. As I retraced my steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. By the time I reached my tent, I was sweating and out of breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, faint, irregular sounds coming from the woods. At first, I told myself it was just animals, but the longer it went on, the harder it was to believe. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my campsite. I stayed perfectly still, clutching the knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped after what felt like an eternity, but I didn't dare move until dawn. When the sun rose, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt oppressive. Every shadow looked like a figure, and every sound set my nerves on edge. As I hiked, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. About halfway back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the trail ahead of me, there were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped and listened, but the forest was eerily silent. Whoever had made those prints was close. I decided to leave the trail and cut through the woods to avoid whoever it was. It was risky and disorienting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. The underbrush was thick, and I struggled to move quietly. After what felt like hours, I stumbled back onto the trail, closer to the trailhead. Relief washed over me when I saw the parking lot in the distance. But as I got closer, my relief turned to dread. The old pickup truck was still there, and now it was parked next to my car. The driver's door was open, but I didn't see anyone around. I approached cautiously, my knife in hand. My car looked untouched, but when I opened the door, I saw a piece of paper on the driver's seat. It had one word scrawled on it in shaky handwriting: "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A man was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. He was tall and thin, wearing a faded jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his posture was tense, almost predatory. I drove nonstop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a motel and locked myself in for the night. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm certain of one thing: I'll never go back to that forest again. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a simple camping trip to get away from the noise of the city, to recharge, to clear my head. A couple of days in the woods with just a tent, a fire, and the sounds of nature to keep me company. But when I think about it now, I realize how wrong it all went, how the wilderness changed from a place of peace to something far more menacing. The plan was to camp in a remote part of the forest, a location that I'd read about online and thought would be perfect for some solitude. It was away from the usual camping grounds, deep into the woods where no one could bother you. The perfect spot if you wanted peace and quiet. There were some warnings, sure, but they seemed exaggerated, the kind of stories you hear around a campfire, nothing to take seriously. I arrived in the area late in the afternoon, with just enough time to set up before nightfall. The forest was thick here, the trees towering above me with heavy canopies that blocked out much of the sunlight. It gave the place a dark, almost oppressive feel, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just the nature of the woods. Setting up camp was simple enough. I pitched my tent near a small clearing and started a fire. I had brought enough food and supplies to last me the whole weekend, and I figured I could just enjoy the evening by the fire. The air was cool, crisp, the perfect temperature for a night out in the woods. As I sat there, staring into the fire, I felt a strange sense of calm. The crackling of the logs and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind were soothing. But as the sun set and the forest darkened around me, that calm started to feel more like isolation. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. The sounds of animals, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, they all seemed to fade. It was replaced by a heavy silence, the kind that presses in on you, making you feel like you're being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, it's easy to get caught up in the atmosphere of the wilderness, especially when you're alone. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fire crackled and popped, sending small embers into the night air. I had made sure to keep it small, to avoid drawing too much attention, but as I sat there, I started to wonder, who could I possibly be attracting out here? I tried to distract myself by looking at the stars, but even that felt strange. The sky above was clearer than I had expected, the stars twinkling like tiny jewels in the deep blackness. Yet, the longer I stared, the more it felt like the vastness of the sky was pressing down on me, closing in, making me feel smaller and smaller. My eyes kept shifting to the tree line, where the shadows of the forest seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. Every creak of a branch or rustle of the underbrush seemed amplified in the silence, and I couldn't help but imagine eyes watching me from the darkness. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on the fire, but that's when I heard it. A sound, a soft, almost imperceptible movement, like something brushing against the ground. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears to listen. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light of the fire. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a small creature moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, closer this time, followed by another sound, like the crunching of leaves underfoot. I stood up, grabbing the flashlight I had left beside me and turning it toward the sound. My beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest floor. But there was nothing. No sign of any animals, no movement. Just trees, shadows, and the thick underbrush. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching me, but I told myself it was just my nerves. Still, I couldn't relax. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and despite the warmth of the fire, I felt a chill creeping up my spine. I stoked the fire, hoping the flames would provide some comfort, but deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. The forest was too quiet, too still. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something. By the time the clock struck midnight, I couldn't take it any longer. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every small noise outside made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move. I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the tent roof, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The forest was just the forest, and the silence was normal, right? At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, the first light of morning was filtering through the trees. I let out a deep breath of relief. The night had passed. I was still here in one piece. I was fine. But as I started to pack up, I noticed something that sent a cold shiver through me. Tracks, large, irregular footprints in the dirt around my campsite, leading away from the edge of the clearing and into the woods. They were too big to be from any animal I knew of, at least any animal I was familiar with. The toes were too wide, the shape too human-like. I felt my heart rate spike as I looked around, wondering if someone had been out there, watching me. But the tracks didn't make sense. The ground was soft, freshly disturbed. I hadn't seen anyone come through here, not in the last 24 hours. And yet, the tracks were clear. Whoever or whatever had left them was close, much closer than I would have liked. I considered leaving, but something in me, something stubborn, made me stay. I wasn't going to let fear drive me out of the woods. I'd made it this far, and I was going to finish what I started. But that afternoon, things took another turn. As I was gathering wood for the fire, I heard the sound again, the soft, slow crunching of footsteps through the underbrush. This time, it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there, just beyond my sight. I grabbed my flashlight and turned toward the sound, but there was nothing, not even a shadow moving. My instincts told me to pack up and leave, but I didn't, not yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, and the thought of turning my back on it made me feel more vulnerable. I stayed in that campsite for another few hours, but when the sun began to set again, I couldn't deny it any longer. I wasn't alone. It wasn't until I packed up and started making my way back down the trail that I felt a strange sense of peace. I was still scared, but the overwhelming tension was lifting, bit by bit. And that's when I heard it, the crunching sound again, but this time much louder, as if it were following me, staying just out of my line of sight. I didn't run, couldn't. There was nowhere to run to, But I kept walking, faster now, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. I could hear it getting closer, the sounds of footsteps in the brush, but still no sight of whoever or whatever was there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the forest. The sunlight was fading, the sky streaked with orange and purple. I had made it out. I was out of the woods, safe. It took me a couple of weeks to fully shake off the feeling of being watched, but the peace I felt as I drove home that day was real. There's something about the woods, something about being that far out, that changes you. It wasn't ghosts or some supernatural force. It was just the forest, just the raw, untamed wilderness. But when you're that deep into it, the lines between safe and unsafe, between human and wild, get a little blurred. Now, every time I head back into the woods, I remember that night, the silence, the tracks, the footsteps that never quite let up. I can't explain it, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go camping there again. Camping alone in the wilderness was something I had always dreamed of. The idea of being surrounded by nature, away from the noise and stress of daily life, felt like the perfect way to reset my mind. So when I finally managed to carve out a long weekend from my schedule, I packed my gear, loaded up my car, and drove out to a remote area in the mountains. I chose a spot I had read about online, a place that was supposed to be beautiful but not overly popular. I wanted solitude, and I was determined to find it. The drive took me deep into the forest, the paved road giving way to a gravel one and eventually a dirt trail. My GPS lost signal about an hour in, but I had printed out a map as a backup. The dense trees closed in around me, their shadows stretching across the road as the sun dipped lower in the sky. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. The air was crisp and cool, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. I parked my car, hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through towering pines and past trickling streams. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt myself truly relax. I walked for about 2 hours before I found a clearing that seemed ideal for setting up camp. It was a flat area surrounded by trees, with a small stream nearby for water. The ground was soft and covered in moss, and there was even a fire pit left by previous campers. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. My tent was new, and it took some trial and error to get it pitched properly. By the time I had everything set up, the tent, my sleeping bag, and a small area for cooking, the sun had almost disappeared behind the mountains. The sky turned a deep orange, then purple, before fading to black. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal of canned soup and bread, and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The fire crackled softly, and the stars above seemed endless. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the sun streaming through the trees. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I spent the day hiking further into the forest, following a smaller trail that led to a stunning overlook. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in trees stretched out as far as I could see. I sat there for a while, soaking it all in, before heading back to camp. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed something strange. A pile of sticks near the edge of my campsite had been rearranged. I was certain they hadn't been like that when I left in the morning. The sticks were stacked neatly, almost like a small pyramid. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a curious raccoon or a bird. Still, it made me uneasy. I decided to move the sticks away from my camp and toss them further into the woods. After that, I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on enjoying the evening. The second night was different. I had trouble falling asleep, and when I finally did, I kept waking up to faint noises outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind or small animals moving through the underbrush. But as the night went on, the sounds grew louder and more distinct. It wasn't just rustling leaves. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a deer or some other animal. But the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They were too heavy, too measured. I stayed completely still, straining to hear. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening too. Eventually, the sounds stopped and the forest went silent. I lay awake for hours, clutching the small camping knife I had brought with me, until the first light of dawn filtered through the fabric of my tent. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, there was no sign of anything unusual. No footprints, no disturbed ground. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. I spent the day close to camp, too unsettled to wander far. Every little sound put me on edge. The forest, which had felt peaceful and inviting just a day before, now seemed menacing. The towering trees felt like walls closing in, and the shadows seemed darker. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I had come here for solitude and adventure, and I didn't want to let my imagination ruin it. That evening, I built my fire larger than usual, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. I sat close to the flames, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. For a while, everything seemed normal. The chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only noises. But as the night deepened, I started hearing the footsteps again. This time, they were more distinct. They started at the edge of the clearing and slowly moved closer. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, trying to see what was out there. The fire cast flickering shadows, making it hard to tell if I was imagining movement or if something was really there. The footsteps stopped just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I gripped my knife and flashlight, ready for anything. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crash, like something heavy falling or being thrown. I jumped to my feet, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beam of light illuminated the trees, but I didn't see anything. The crashing sound didn't come again, but the footsteps resumed, retreating this time. They faded into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire until the sun rose, knife in hand, eyes darting at every sound. As soon as it was light enough to see, I started packing up my gear. I didn't care about finishing my trip or enjoying the last day. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to my car felt longer than it had on the way in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the trail remained empty, and I reached my car without incident. As I drove away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The forest, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a place I never wanted to return to. When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Maybe it was just an animal, and my imagination had filled in the rest. Or maybe someone had been out there watching me, messing with me. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I had always loved camping, and this trip was supposed to be no different. The plan was simple: a solo weekend out in the wilderness to clear my head and escape the noise of daily life. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. It was late autumn, and the crisp air and vibrant leaves made it the perfect time for a quiet retreat. I packed everything meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, and a small emergency kit. I'd done this before, so I felt confident. The drive was uneventful, the kind where you're left alone with your thoughts and the scenery. I turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that wound through dense woods. The farther I drove, the fewer signs of human life I saw. After about 40 minutes, I reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by towering trees and with a small creek running nearby. The sound of flowing water was soothing, and the area looked untouched, like no one had been there in ages. After pitching my tent and organizing my gear, I decided to explore the surroundings before the sun set. The forest was dense but manageable, with paths formed by wildlife. The crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush were the only sounds. I felt a sense of peace, the kind that only nature can provide. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I lit a small campfire and cooked a simple dinner. Sitting there, staring into the flames, I felt truly alone but not lonely. The kind of solitude that feels like a reset for your soul. After eating, I stayed by the fire for a while, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the forest. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the distant hoots of an owl. The first night passed without incident, though I woke up a few times to the sound of something moving outside. Probably deer or raccoons, I thought. When morning came, I made coffee over the fire and planned my day. I wanted to hike farther into the forest, following the creek upstream to see where it led. I packed a small day pack with essentials: water, snacks, a map, and a knife, and set off. The hike was invigorating. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with activity. Birds flitted between trees, squirrels darted across the ground, and occasionally I'd hear the distant call of a larger animal. The creek led me to a small waterfall, no more than 10 feet high but picturesque. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and enjoying the view. It was moments like these that made the effort of camping worthwhile. As I started back toward camp, I noticed something odd. A tree near the path had deep scratches on its trunk, too high and wide to be from a small animal. Bears, maybe? It wasn't unheard of in this area, though sightings were rare. I made a mental note to be more cautious and continued on. When I returned to my campsite, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything was where I'd left it: the tent, my gear, even the fire pit. But the atmosphere had changed. It was quieter than before. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I brushed it off as my imagination and went about preparing for the evening. As the sun set, the feeling of unease grew. The silence was oppressive, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a predator was nearby, causing the smaller animals to stay quiet. But as the night deepened, I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I kept the fire going longer than usual, its light and warmth offering some comfort. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, clutching my knife under the sleeping bag. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were deliberate, not the random scurrying of an animal. Someone or something was walking around my campsite. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. The steps circled the tent, slow and measured. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. I didn't move for the rest of the night, too scared to even unzip the tent and look outside. When dawn finally came, I emerged cautiously. The campsite looked untouched, no sign of whatever had been there. I tried to convince myself it had been an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I decided to cut the trip short. Packing up took longer than usual because I kept stopping to look over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. As I loaded the last of my gear into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the trunk of a tree near the campsite, there were fresh scratches, similar to the ones I'd seen during my hike, but these were different. They formed an unmistakable pattern, almost like a symbol. It wasn't random claw marks. I didn't stick around to analyze it. I got in my car and drove away, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The sense of relief I expected to feel once I left the forest never came. Even now, back in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. I've gone over that trip 100 times in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Was it a person, an animal, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it's out there in those woods waiting. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone. I had always been a fan of the outdoors, and after a stressful few weeks at work, I thought some time away from the noise and bustle of the city would do me good. There was a spot I had heard about from a friend, a remote area in the mountains that promised solitude, clean air, and stunning views. It seemed perfect. The drive to the trailhead took most of the morning. The farther I got from civilization, the narrower and more winding the roads became. By the time I reached the parking lot, there were only a couple of cars there, and neither of them seemed to belong to people who were camping. It was already early afternoon, but I wasn't worried. The hike to the campsite was only a few miles, and I had a detailed map. I should have plenty of daylight to set up before nightfall. The trail was beautiful. Towering trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into soft, golden patches. Birds called from the treetops, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. I took my time, stopping occasionally to take in the scenery or snap a picture. It felt good to be out here, away from the constant hum of the city. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the campsite. It was everything I had hoped for. There was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with just enough open space for my tent and a fire pit. Beyond the clearing, the ground sloped down to a crystal-clear stream. I set my pack down and stretched, feeling a sense of accomplishment and anticipation. This was going to be a good weekend. Setting up camp took less than an hour. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the stream that I could hear the gentle rush of water. I gathered some firewood and built a small fire, even though I didn't plan to cook anything tonight. It felt comforting to have the flames crackling as the evening set in. The first night was uneventful. After a simple dinner of trail mix and a granola bar, I sat by the fire and watched the stars come out. The sky was unbelievably clear, and I could see more stars than I ever could back home. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the rush of the stream, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt completely at peace. I slept well that night, lulled by the soothing sounds of nature. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the campsite. I made a quick breakfast and decided to spend the day exploring the area. There was a trail that followed the stream upstream, and I was curious to see where it led. The hike was more challenging than I expected. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and I had to climb over fallen logs and navigate around patches of mud. But the scenery made it worth the effort. The stream grew wider as I went, with small waterfalls tumbling over rocks and pools of water that looked deep enough to swim in. I stopped several times to rest and take it all in. By midday, I had reached a particularly beautiful spot where the stream widened into a small lake. The water was so clear I could see fish darting around near the bottom. I sat on a large rock at the edge of the lake, eating my lunch and enjoying the view. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, completely removed from the rest of the world. It was late afternoon by the time I made it back to camp. I was tired but satisfied, and I looked forward to a quiet evening by the fire. But as I approached the clearing, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had gathered the night before was scattered around the campsite. At first, I thought an animal might have gotten into it, but the way the pieces were spread out didn't make sense. It looked almost like someone had kicked them around. I felt a prickle of unease but brushed it off. Maybe it had been a strong wind, or maybe I just hadn't stacked the wood as securely as I thought. I gathered the pieces and rebuilt the pile, then tried to put it out of my mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises outside the tent. They weren't loud, just faint rustlings and occasional snaps of twigs. I told myself it was probably just animals, raccoons or deer moving through the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about, but it was a long time before I finally drifted off. The next morning, I found more signs that someone, or something, had been at my campsite. The fire pit had been disturbed, with ashes and partially burned wood scattered around. One of my water bottles was missing, and another had been knocked over and emptied. My unease grew, but I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had accidentally knocked over the bottle myself. Maybe the fire pit had been disturbed by an animal. I didn't want to let my imagination run wild. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I spent the morning collecting more firewood and checking my gear. Everything else seemed to be in order, which was reassuring. I ate a quick lunch and spent the afternoon reading a book I had brought with me. By evening, I was starting to feel more relaxed. Maybe I had just been overthinking things. That night, the noises came back. They were louder this time and more frequent. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, followed by a low, heavy breathing. My heart pounded as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear more. The footsteps circled the tent, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was or whatever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what. I had no weapons, and the idea of confronting whatever was out there terrified me. Instead, I lay there, hoping that if I stayed quiet, it would go away. After what felt like hours, the noises finally stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening for any sign of movement. When the sun rose, I stepped out of the tent to survey the campsite. The firewood was scattered again, and one of the tent stakes had been pulled out of the ground. My missing water bottle was lying near the edge of the clearing, empty. But the most chilling discovery was a set of footprints in the dirt. They were large and unmistakably human. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the car felt like it took twice as long as it had on the way in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my pack in the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I felt a wave of relief. But as I drove away, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. I still don't know who or what was out there that weekend. I've told myself it was probably just another camper, maybe someone who didn't realize I was there. But the way the footsteps circled my tent, the way the fire pit and gear were disturbed, felt deliberate. I haven't been camping alone since. The wilderness used to feel like a place of peace and solitude, but now it just feels unpredictable and sometimes unsafe. I decided to take a weekend off from work to clear my head. Life had been exhausting lately. Deadlines, endless meetings, and the constant hum of city noise that never seemed to fade. I figured a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to reset. I packed my gear on Friday morning. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, some food, and a good pair of hiking boots. My destination was a remote part of the forest about 3 hours from the city, a place I'd heard about but never visited. I arrived at the trailhead around noon. The parking lot was empty, just the way I wanted it. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started walking. The trail was well marked at first, winding through tall pines and the occasional clearing where sunlight streamed through. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of moss and damp earth. It felt good to be away from the chaos of urban life. After about an hour of hiking, the trail became narrower and less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches weaving a canopy overhead. I checked my map and compass to make sure I was still on track. I'd planned to reach a small lake by late afternoon and set up camp there. According to the map, the lake was nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest, with no marked trails leading directly to it. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to feel truly isolated. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sunset. There wasn't a single sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I picked a flat spot near the shore and pitched my tent. Once the camp was set up, I boiled some water on my portable stove and made instant noodles. Sitting by the lake, eating my simple meal, I felt a rare sense of peace. Night fell quickly, and the forest became a black void beyond the glow of my flashlight. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, feeling the cool night air settle around me. The first few hours were uneventful. I listened to the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was comforting at first, but as the night wore on, those sounds seemed to amplify. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig felt like it was right outside my tent. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had roused me. I lay still, listening. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if holding its breath. Then I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart began to race. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deliberate. I stayed frozen, straining to hear more. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Whoever or whatever it was had paused not far from my tent. I'd brought a small camping knife, but the thought of confronting someone in the dark was terrifying. Instead, I decided to wait and listen. Minutes passed, and the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just another camper passing through, though the chances of that seemed slim given the remoteness of the area. The rest of the night passed fitfully. I dozed off only to wake up at the slightest noise. When dawn finally broke, I emerged from my tent, exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I looked around the campsite but saw no signs of anyone else. The ground near my tent didn't show any clear footprints, just the usual scattering of leaves and pine needles. Still, the memory of those footsteps lingered in my mind. I decided to stay another night despite my unease. I told myself I was overreacting, that the forest was full of noises, and not all of them needed an explanation. During the day, I explored the area around the lake, following animal trails and taking in the beauty of the untouched wilderness. By evening, I felt calmer and more confident. I cooked another simple meal and sat by the lake again, watching the sun set. That night, the forest was eerily quiet. The usual symphony of nocturnal creatures was absent. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric ceiling, trying to convince myself that the silence was just a coincidence. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were heavier and closer, moving directly toward my tent. My pulse thundered in my ears. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Then came a sound that chilled me to my core. The unmistakable scratch of a hand brushing against the tent fabric. I shouted, hoping to scare off whoever was out there, but there was no response. The scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was no one there. I scanned the trees, the bushes, the ground, but found nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my camp and started hiking back toward the trailhead. Every step felt like it took an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less inviting, more oppressive. Every shadow felt like a potential threat. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. I didn't see anyone during the hike back, and I didn't find any clear evidence of another person. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. As I drove away, I vowed never to camp alone again. Whatever or whoever was out there had wanted me to know they were there, and that was enough to turn my peaceful escape into a nightmare. Even now, the thought of returning to the wilderness makes my chest tighten. The forest, once a place of solace, has become a place of unease. A reminder that sometimes solitude isn't as safe as it seems. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The thought of escaping my cramped apartment and spending a week in the wilderness was the only thing that had kept me going during the endless hours at my desk job. I wanted solitude, a chance to reset, and maybe a little adventure. I packed my gear meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and enough water to last me the first few days. I figured I could filter more from the streams in the area. My destination was a remote section of a national forest, a place I had heard about from a coworker who said it was the perfect spot to get away from it all. The drive was uneventful but long, and by the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. I should have started earlier, but I wasn't worried. I had mapped out a route to a campsite a few miles in. I could set up before dark if I kept a steady pace. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, double-checked the straps, and headed down the trail. It felt good to breathe the fresh air and hear nothing but the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. The trail was well marked, and the dense forest around me seemed alive but peaceful. About an hour in, I noticed the first sign that something was off. A section of the trail had been disturbed. The dirt was churned up as if someone or something had run through in a hurry. I stopped and looked around, but everything was quiet. Shrugging it off, I kept moving. I told myself it was probably just an animal. Deer, maybe. This was their home after all. When I reached the campsite, the sun had almost set. The spot was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a faint path leading to a nearby stream. I quickly set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and started a small fire to cook dinner. As I sat there eating, the sounds of the forest grew louder. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me I wasn't alone. It was comforting at first, but as the night deepened, the noises began to feel oppressive. I told myself I was just tired and crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside seemed amplified. The snap of a twig made my heart race, and the rustle of leaves had me straining to hear more. I told myself it was just animals, but there was something about the way the noises stopped and started that felt deliberate. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something had changed. The forest was silent, completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling leaves. Just the faint crackle of the dying fire outside my tent. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear anything. Then I caught it. A faint crunch of leaves, followed by another, closer this time. It wasn't the random movement of an animal. It was deliberate, measured, like footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my own breathing, loud and shallow, as I gripped the knife tighter. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, I couldn't tell. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before I dared to unzip the tent and look outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the clearing. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. I told myself it must have been an animal and forced myself to go back to sleep, though it was more like lying there with my eyes closed, knife in hand, until morning. The next day, I decided to move campsites. I told myself it was because I wanted to explore more of the forest, but deep down, I knew I didn't want to spend another night in that spot. I packed up and headed further into the wilderness. The trail became less defined, and I had to rely on my map and compass to navigate. By midday, I found another clearing, this one smaller and less open than the last. It felt safer somehow, more tucked away. I set up camp and spent the afternoon gathering firewood and filtering water from a nearby stream. As evening fell, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just my imagination running wild. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the feeling crept back. That sense of being watched, of not being alone. I forced myself to eat dinner and stay by the fire, trying to focus on the warmth and light. But the noises started again. This time, they were closer and more frequent. The rustling in the bushes, the snapping of twigs. I felt like I was surrounded, even though I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. I decided to stay up and keep the fire going as long as I could. I added wood, watching the flames dance and trying to convince myself that fire was a good deterrent. But around midnight, the noises stopped again, just like the night before. The silence was deafening, and that's when I heard it. The faintest sound of breathing, just beyond the edge of the light. It was slow and even not hurried like an animal's. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But the breathing continued, steady and unchanging. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up and started moving. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was out there. I followed the stream for hours, staying off the main trail. The forest seemed different now, less inviting. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, and my nerves were frayed. I found a spot near a rocky outcrop and set up camp, hoping the natural barrier would make me feel safer. I built a fire and ate a quick meal before settling in for another sleepless night. This time, I stayed inside my tent, knife in hand, and tried to block out the sounds outside. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. Footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tightly my hand ached. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, and with it, that suffocating sense of being watched. I didn't dare move. I stayed like that until dawn, every muscle in my body tense. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and started hiking again, though I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just wanted to get out of the forest. By the 4th day, I was completely lost. My map and compass were useless. Every direction looked the same. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer and closer. My food was running low, and I hadn't seen another person since I started. The thought of being out there alone with whatever was following me was almost too much to bear. That night, I didn't even bother setting up my tent. I found a spot between 2 large rocks and huddled there, knife in hand, waiting for the inevitable. The noises started again, but this time they were different. Louder, more aggressive. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. Branches snapped, bushes shook, and someone, was moving through the forest with purpose. I felt trapped, cornered. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but it didn't help. The beam just bounced off the trees, creating more shadows. Then, out of nowhere, a figure emerged into the edge of the light. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained, and his face obscured by a tangled beard. He didn't say anything, didn't move closer. He just stood there, watching me. I froze, every instinct telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I started moving again, stumbling through the forest in a blind panic. I didn't care about the trail or my gear anymore. I just wanted out. By sheer luck, I stumbled onto a dirt road late in the afternoon. I followed it until I came across a small ranger station. I must have looked half dead because the ranger immediately called for help. I never went back to that forest. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I've heard enough stories to guess. Maybe he was living out there, avoiding civilization. Maybe he didn't want me in his territory. Whatever the case, I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the feeling of being watched. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and it taught me one thing. The wilderness might be beautiful, but it's not always safe. When I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the woods, it felt like the perfect way to unwind. Life had been stressful, and I needed time away from the city. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I picked a spot about 2 hours drive from home, a place I'd been to once before with friends. The campsite was secluded, surrounded by dense forest with a narrow, winding trail leading down to a small, clear lake. It was perfect. I left early on a Saturday morning, my car loaded with supplies. The drive out was uneventful, the city fading into rolling hills and then thickening trees. By the time I reached the gravel road leading to the campsite, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. It was a warm autumn day, the kind where the sunlight filters through the trees in golden patches. The air smelled crisp, with just a hint of decaying leaves. I parked my car in a small clearing and unloaded my gear. The trail to the campsite was about 1.5 miles, so I had to carry everything in one trip. My pack was heavy, but the walk was peaceful. Birds chirped overhead, and I could hear the faint rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. The trail narrowed as I went deeper into the forest, and the sounds of civilization faded away entirely. When I reached the campsite, I found it just as I remembered. A flat, open space surrounded by tall pines, with a fire pit in the center and plenty of room to pitch a tent. Beyond the campsite, the ground sloped down to the lake, its surface glinting in the sunlight. I set up my tent first, making sure it was on level ground and securely staked. Then I unpacked my sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and food. By mid-afternoon, everything was in place, and I had a small fire crackling in the pit. I spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The trail around the lake was overgrown in places, but I managed to follow it most of the way. I found a few animal tracks in the mud near the water. Deer, I assumed, and a few broken branches that looked like something larger had passed through recently. It didn't bother me. This was the wilderness, after all. Animals were part of the experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, canned soup and some bread. The woods grew darker and quieter, the daytime sounds of birds and squirrels replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant rustle of leaves. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the solitude. The stars were brilliant, scattered across a black sky like glitter. It was the kind of night that makes you feel small in the best possible way. I turned in early, tired from the hike and the fresh air. The tent was cozy, and I fell asleep almost immediately. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, a soft crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart raced as I lay still, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, moving closer to the tent. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless animal. After a few minutes, the noise stopped, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Around the campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. They weren't mine. These were larger, heavier, and spaced farther apart. I tried to convince myself they were old, left by some previous camper, but they looked fresh. The edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by wind or rain. I spent the morning trying to shake off the unease. I went back down to the lake, hoping to clear my head. The water was still, the surface like glass. I sat on a rock by the shore, letting the sun warm my face. It helped, but only a little. The footprints were a nagging thought at the back of my mind. By afternoon, I decided to stay busy. I gathered more firewood, making several trips to collect enough for the night. As I worked, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone watching me. But the woods were empty, just the trees and the occasional bird. That night, I kept the fire burning brighter and longer. The shadows beyond the campsite felt deeper, darker. I ate quickly, then sat with my back to the tent, facing the fire. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every little sound stand out. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whipped around, but there was nothing there. When I finally went to bed, I left my knife within easy reach, just in case. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle, every creak of the trees made my heart pound. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. But once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't footsteps. It was a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the ground. I held my breath, listening. The noise moved around the tent, slow and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities, an animal, maybe, but it didn't sound like one. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I lay awake for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, until the first light of dawn crept through the tent. In the daylight, the campsite looked normal. There was no sign of whatever had made the noise, no tracks or disturbed ground. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up quickly, my eyes constantly scanning the trees. The hike back to the car felt longer than it should have. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the car. The driver's side door was open, and the inside was a mess. My glove compartment had been rifled through, papers scattered across the seat. The backpack I'd left in the trunk was gone, along with my spare phone charger and a few other items. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been here. I got in the car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The drive back to the main road was nerve-wracking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Looking back, I'm not sure what scared me more, the noises in the night or the realization that someone had been in my campsite, possibly watching me. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel like a refuge anymore. They feel like a place where you're utterly alone, vulnerable, and at the mercy of things you can't always explain. I've always been a fan of camping, but my last trip out in the woods made me reconsider everything I thought I loved about it. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a break from the noise of everyday life, but it turned into an experience I'll never forget, no matter how much I try. It wasn't because of anything supernatural, but because of how close I came to something I never thought would happen to me. The trip began like any other. I had planned to hike out to a remote part of a national forest and spend 3 nights camping alone. I'd done solo trips like this before and had always found them refreshing. There was something about being out there, completely disconnected from the world, that made me feel alive. I packed my gear carefully: a tent, sleeping bag, enough food for the trip, a water filter, first aid kit, and a map of the area. My phone was fully charged, but I didn't expect to have service out there. That was part of the appeal: no texts, no emails, no distractions. I started the hike in the morning. The trailhead was quiet, with only a couple of cars parked in the small gravel lot. The air was cool and crisp, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. I shouldered my pack and set off, feeling that familiar sense of freedom and anticipation. The trail was well marked at first, winding through tall trees and patches of wildflowers. I made good time, enjoying the solitude and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. After about 4 hours, I reached the point where I planned to leave the main trail and head deeper into the forest. This part of the trip required careful navigation, as there were no marked paths. I'd studied the map beforehand and felt confident in my ability to find my way. I took a compass reading and stepped off the trail, the sound of my boots crunching on leaves and twigs the only noise around me. The forest felt different once I left the trail. The trees were denser and the undergrowth thicker. I had to push through bushes and step over fallen logs, making my progress slower. Still, I enjoyed the challenge. By late afternoon, I found a spot that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was a small clearing near a creek, with enough flat ground for my tent and plenty of firewood nearby. I set up my tent, gathered wood for a fire, and filtered water from the creek to refill my bottles. As the sun set, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. The flames cast flickering shadows on the trees, and the sound of the creek was soothing. I felt content, even a little proud of myself for making it this far. I sat by the fire for a while, watching the stars come out and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was quiet, apart from the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of an owl. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and fell asleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke up early, feeling rested and ready to explore the area. After breakfast, I packed a small day pack with water and snacks and set off to see what I could find. The forest was beautiful, with towering trees and patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I came across a small meadow filled with wildflowers and saw deer grazing in the distance. Felt like I was in a postcard. But as the day went on, I started to notice signs that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. At first, it was subtle. A faint trail through the underbrush that didn't look like it was made by animals. A soda can half buried in the dirt. I told myself it was probably from other hikers or hunters. This was public land, after all. Still, it made me uneasy. I'd chosen this area specifically because it was supposed to be remote, far from where most people ventured. That evening, as I sat by the fire again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed quieter than the night before. I kept turning my head, thinking I'd heard something, but it was always nothing, just the wind in the trees or the crackle of the fire. I told myself I was being paranoid. There was no reason to think anyone was out there. The second night was when things started to go wrong. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed me. It was still dark, and for a moment, I lay there, listening. Then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside my tent. My heart started pounding. I stayed as still as I could, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the campsite. They stopped for a moment, then started again, circling the tent. I wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't move like that. I didn't have a weapon, only a small camping knife that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. I reached for it anyway, gripping the handle tightly. The footsteps stopped again, and I held my breath, waiting. Minutes passed, and I started to wonder if whoever or whatever it was had left. But then I heard a new sound, the unmistakable rustle of someone going through my backpack. I'd left the pack outside the tent, near the fire pit. My mind raced. Should I call out? Stay silent? Try to scare them off? I decided to stay quiet, hoping they'd take what they wanted and leave. The rustling continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped. I didn't hear anything else after that, but I didn't dare move. I lay there, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out, the campsite looked undisturbed at first glance. But when I checked my backpack, I saw that it had been opened. Some of my food was missing, along with a flashlight and a small first aid kit. The realization that someone had been that close to me while I slept sent a chill down my spine. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I'd planned to stay another night, and I hated the idea of cutting the trip short. I convinced myself that whoever it was had probably moved on. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't realize I was there. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease, exploring the area and sticking close to camp. I didn't see any signs of anyone else. That night, I built the fire higher than usual, hoping it would deter anyone from coming near. I kept the knife close at hand and stayed up late, listening. The forest was silent again, unnervingly so. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the zipper partially open so I could see out. I didn't sleep much, every little sound setting me on edge. Sometime in the early morning hours, I heard it again. Footsteps, heavier this time, coming from the direction of the creek. My pulse quickened as I sat up, peering out through the small opening in the tent. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see shapes in the clearing. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw movement. A figure, tall and human, stepping into the edge of the light. They were just standing there watching the tent. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The figure didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, they turned and walked back into the trees. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then packed up my gear as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't care that it was still dark. I wasn't staying another minute. The hike back to the main trail was the longest I've ever done. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced they were following me. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I threw my pack in the trunk and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the forest. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just a drifter looking for supplies, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know, and I'm okay with that. All I know is that I'm not in a hurry to go camping alone again. The woods may be beautiful, but they're also unpredictable, and sometimes they're more than a little dangerous. I've always enjoyed camping. There's something about being out in the wild, surrounded by trees, fresh air, and the sound of nature. It's a break from the monotony of city life and the constant buzz of phones and computers. So when I got a free weekend, I decided to pack my gear and head to a spot I had been meaning to visit for a long time. It was a secluded area, tucked deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from my place. It wasn't a popular campsite, which made it even more appealing. No noisy families, no loud music, just me, the wilderness, and some much-needed solitude. The drive there was uneventful. The roads wound through small towns and rolling hills before transitioning into dense forest. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The parking lot was empty, which I took as a good sign. I checked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 2 nights, a first aid kit, and a portable stove. Everything was in order. After locking up my car, I hoisted my backpack and set off on the trail. The hike to the campsite was about 4 miles, mostly uphill. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, a clear indication that it wasn't heavily used. I didn't mind. The solitude was what I was after. The forest around me was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the chirping of birds, and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned out, offering glimpses of the valley below. The view was stunning, the kind that makes you stop and take a deep breath just to let it all sink in. I reached the campsite about an hour before sunset. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a fire pit in the center. There were no signs of recent use, no scattered trash or trampled grass. Perfect. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground and gathered some dry wood for a fire. By the time I got the fire going, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I cooked a simple meal on my portable stove and ate while the fire crackled in front of me. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. As night fell, the forest came alive with a different set of sounds. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the trees, creating an almost hypnotic effect. I stayed up for a while, staring into the flames and letting my mind wander. Eventually, the fatigue from the hike caught up with me, and I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up the flap. The sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and it didn't take long for me to drift off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I lay there, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. My first thought was that it was an animal. Deer, raccoons, even bears were common in these parts. But this didn't sound like an animal. The rustling was too deliberate, too steady. It was moving in a slow, methodical way, circling the clearing. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear more. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed, closer this time. My heart was pounding now, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I reached for the flashlight I'd left by my side and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside, sweeping the light across the clearing. Nothing. The fire pit, the trees, the surrounding brush, everything looked normal. But the sound was still there, moving just beyond the edge of the light. I debated whether to call out, but something told me not to. Instead, I sat there, flashlight in hand, listening. The rustling continued for a while, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge, but the sound didn't return. After what felt like an eternity, I lay back down, though I didn't sleep much for the rest of the night. The next morning, the forest seemed peaceful again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and birds chirped overhead. It was hard to reconcile the unease I'd felt during the night with the serene scene around me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it had been an animal after all. Maybe a curious raccoon or a deer passing through. I ate a quick breakfast and decided to spend the day exploring the area. There was a stream nearby, according to the map, and I figured a short hike would help clear my head. The stream was about half a mile from the campsite, nestled in a small ravine. The water was clear and cold, and I spent some time sitting on the bank, listening to the gentle babble of the current. It was calming, almost enough to make me forget the unease of the previous night. Almost. As I made my way back to the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle, more of an instinct than anything concrete, but it was there, gnawing at the back of my mind. When I returned, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The fire pit, which I'd left cold and undisturbed, now had a small pile of ashes in it. Not much, just enough to suggest that someone had lit a small fire while I was gone. I froze, my eyes scanning the clearing. There was no one there, but the sense of unease came rushing back, stronger than before. I checked my gear. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place. But the fact that someone had been here while I was away sent a chill down my spine. I decided to pack up and leave. As much as I loved camping, my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I hurriedly broke down my tent and stuffed everything into my backpack. The hike back to the car felt longer than it had on the way in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. My car was right where I'd left it, undisturbed. I threw my backpack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled out onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The forest stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. I've thought about that trip a lot since then, replaying every detail in my mind. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I'm certain of one thing. I wasn't alone. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. The wilderness, for all its beauty, has a way of reminding you just how vulnerable you really are. It was supposed to be an escape, a weekend in the wilderness to clear my head, to leave behind the buzzing city life and the endless noise. I packed my gear, my tent, enough food and water for 3 days, and drove 3 hours to a remote camping site I had found online. The place wasn't on any official maps, which made it all the more appealing. It was tucked away in a national forest, miles from the nearest town. I parked my car at the trailhead, strapped on my backpack, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places, the kind where you're not sure if you're still on the right path. But I had a map and a GPS, and I'd done enough hiking to feel confident. After about 4 hours, I reached a clearing near a small creek. The place was perfect, flat ground, plenty of space for my tent, and the sound of running water in the background. I set up camp, built a small fire, and settled in for the evening. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read a bit from the book I'd brought, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the temperature dropped. The quiet was unsettling at first. No distant hum of traffic, no chatter from neighbors, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. I eventually fell asleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of the creek. The next day, I decided to explore the area. I left my campsite and followed the creek upstream. The forest felt alive in the daylight, birds chirping, squirrels darting through the underbrush. I found a few interesting spots: a small waterfall, a patch of wildflowers, and what looked like the remnants of an old cabin. The cabin was nothing more than a pile of rotting wood and rusted nails, but it intrigued me. Who had lived out here? Why had they left? Questions I'd never get answers to. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was dipping low in the sky. I made another fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for the evening. That's when I noticed something odd. My campsite didn't look exactly how I'd left it. Nothing was missing, but the placement of a few items felt off. My water bottle was on the other side of the tent, and my flashlight was lying on the ground instead of hanging from the tent's loop. I brushed it off as my own forgetfulness. Maybe I had moved them and didn't remember. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. The usual rustles and creaks of the forest now felt different, sharper, more deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but the slow, deliberate crunch of a human. I held my breath, heart pounding, straining to hear more, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. The third day started with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I decided to stay closer to camp, to keep my bearings. I spent the morning gathering firewood and purifying water from the creek. Around noon, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. On the edge of the clearing, near the tree line, there was a small pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. It looked deliberate, like a cairn or some kind of marker. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe it had always been there, and I just hadn't noticed. By the afternoon, I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like a threat. I started to question my decision to come out here alone. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt suffocating. I considered packing up and leaving early, but I told myself I was overreacting. One more night, I thought. Just one more night, and I'd be heading home. That evening, as the sun set, I double-checked everything. I secured my food in a bear bag and hung it high in a tree. I made sure my tent was zipped up tightly and that my flashlight was within reach. I even kept my knife close, just in case. The fire crackled as I sat by it, staring into the flames and trying to calm my nerves. The forest around me seemed unnaturally quiet.
No birds, no insects.
Just silence. Then I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. A low, guttural noise, like a growl but deeper. It came from the trees behind me, where the cairn had appeared earlier. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but the beam revealed nothing, just trees and shadows. I stayed by the fire, gripping the flashlight and knife, my heart racing. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I barely slept that night. Every noise made me jolt awake. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. I decided to pack up and leave as quickly as possible. As I dismantled my tent and gathered my gear, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. The hike back to my car felt much longer than the hike in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. I kept checking over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, a wave of relief washed over me. I threw my gear in the back seat, started the engine, and didn't look back. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized something chilling. In my rush to leave, I hadn't noticed the new set of footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, and they circled my tent. It all started when I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. Life had been stressful lately, and I thought spending a few days alone in nature would help. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual trails and campsites. It was a place I had visited years ago with some friends, and I remembered it being quiet and untouched, the perfect place to disconnect. I packed everything I thought I'd need: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and my trusted hiking boots. I also carried a map and compass, even though I downloaded the area on my GPS. I knew how unreliable technology could be out here. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours, and by the time I parked my car and started hiking, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The trail was overgrown and barely visible in some places, but I liked that. It meant fewer people came this way. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the clearing I'd been aiming for. A small, flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running nearby. It was as beautiful as I remembered. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some firewood, and started a small campfire. As the flames crackled, I cooked a simple meal and sat back to enjoy the quiet. The only sounds were the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the gentle gurgle of the stream. That first night was uneventful. I slept well, lulled by the sounds of the forest. The next morning, I woke up early, brewed some coffee on my portable stove, and planned to spend the day exploring the area. I wanted to find the old trail that led to a nearby ridge. The view from there was supposed to be incredible. I packed some snacks, a water bottle, and my map and set off. As I walked, the forest grew denser. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely a faint line on the ground. Fallen branches and patches of thick undergrowth slowed me down, but I didn't mind. It was part of the adventure. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen the stream for a while. I should have been following it to the ridge, but somehow I'd veered off course. I checked my map and compass, adjusted my direction, and kept going. The forest felt different here. The trees were closer together, their branches twisting in ways that blocked out the sunlight. The air was cooler, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted. It wasn't exactly unsettling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination and pressed on. Eventually, I found the stream again. Relieved, I followed it until I reached the ridge. The view was worth the effort. Rolling hills stretched out before me, their tops covered in mist. I sat there for a while, eating my snacks and enjoying the solitude. By the time I started heading back, the sun was already sinking low. That's when things started to feel off. The return trip seemed to take longer, even though I was retracing my steps. The forest, which had felt alive and welcoming earlier, now seemed oppressive. Shadows stretched longer, and the air grew colder. I quickened my pace, wanting to get back to my campsite before dark. When I finally reached my tent, it was nearly dusk, but something was wrong. The tent flap was open, even though I was sure I'd zipped it shut. Inside, my belongings were scattered. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but nothing was torn or chewed. My food, which I'd hung in a tree to keep it safe, was untouched. It didn't make sense. I spent the evening on edge, scanning the tree line as I cooked dinner. The fire's light only seemed to make the darkness beyond it deeper. I kept my flashlight and a small knife within arm's reach as I ate. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. Eventually, I convinced myself that it must have been an animal and crawled into my tent. I locked the zipper from the inside and kept my knife close as I tried to sleep. That night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. This was deliberate, like footsteps crunching on leaves. My heart pounded as I lay there, holding my breath. The steps stopped just outside my tent. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed up my campsite and decided to head back to my car. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt hostile. Every step I took, I felt like I was being followed. I stopped several times, listening, but heard nothing unusual. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. The hike back to the car was grueling. I was exhausted from the lack of sleep and the constant stress. When I finally reached the trailhead, I was relieved to see my car still there. But my relief was short-lived. As I approached, I noticed something on the windshield, a single muddy handprint. It was too large to be mine, and I hadn't seen anyone else out here. I didn't stop to think. I threw my gear into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Was it a person? If so, why were they out there so deep in the woods, and why did they approach my tent? Or was it something else entirely? I'll never know. All I know is that I won't be going back to that forest again. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of technology and the never-ending rush of city life. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd done it before, but something about this trip felt different from the start, and not in a good way. I chose a spot deep in the forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. It wasn't a popular campsite, which was precisely why I picked it. I wanted solitude, just me and nature. The trail leading to the campsite was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees that formed a canopy overhead. The forest felt alive. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional scurry of small animals reminded me that I wasn't alone out here. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car at the small gravel lot near the trailhead, and started hiking. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need for a couple of nights. A tent, food, water, a small stove, and other essentials. The trail was well marked but steep in some places, and the weight of my gear made the hike more challenging than I'd expected. Sweat dripped down my face as I trudged along, my boots crunching against the dirt and rocks. After about an hour, I reached the campsite. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. A fire pit sat in the center, ringed with large stones. Nearby, a fallen tree offered a makeshift bench. The place felt secluded, exactly what I'd wanted. I set down my pack and stretched, my muscles aching from the hike. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I pitched my tent quickly, grateful for the practice I'd had on previous trips. By the time the sun disappeared behind the trees, my campsite was ready. I lit a small fire in the pit, its orange glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. I cooked a simple meal, eating slowly as I listened to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd been looking for. As the night wore on, the fire dwindled to glowing embers. The air grew cooler, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, staring up at the stars. They were brilliant out here, free from the light pollution of the city. I felt a deep sense of contentment and eventually crawled into my tent, the sounds of the forest lulling me to sleep. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, the morning light filtering through the trees. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, a snack, and a map. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight streaming through the leaves and the scent of pine heavy in the air. I followed a narrow trail that led away from the clearing, curious to see where it went. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon something strange. The trail opened into another clearing, smaller than the one where I'd set up camp. In the center was a fire pit similar to mine, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. The stones were covered in moss, and the charred wood inside had long since turned to ash. Surrounding the clearing were a few scattered items: a rusted tin can, a faded bandana, and what looked like the remnants of a tent, now little more than tattered fabric clinging to broken poles. The sight gave me an uneasy feeling. It wasn't uncommon to find old campsites in the woods, but something about this one felt off. It was as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry, abandoning their belongings. I lingered for a moment, then shook off the unease and continued my hike. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I returned to my campsite in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied. After dinner, I settled by the fire again, enjoying the quiet. But as darkness fell, that uneasy feeling returned. The forest seemed different at night, the shadows deeper, the sounds sharper. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been alone all day and hadn't seen another soul. Still, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes searching the darkness beyond the firelight. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I decided to turn in early, hoping that sleep would come quickly and chase away the unease. But lying in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I listened intently, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The usual sounds of the forest were there, but beneath them, I thought I heard something else. A faint crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't constant, just the occasional crackle or snap, as if someone, or something, was moving through the woods. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. A deer? A raccoon? But the steps sounded deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body tense. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't know if whoever or whatever it was had left or was simply waiting outside my tent. I didn't dare move, barely breathing until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, I emerged from my tent cautiously, scanning the clearing for any signs of intruders. Everything looked normal. The fire pit, my gear, the surrounding forest. Nothing seemed out of place. I convinced myself that I'd imagined the noises, a product of my overactive mind in the dark. Still, the unease lingered. I decided to stay close to the campsite that day, not wanting to wander too far. I spent the morning gathering firewood and making small adjustments to my setup. By afternoon, I felt more relaxed, the daylight banishing my fears from the night before. As the sun dipped lower, I prepared for another night. I built the fire higher than before, the flames crackling loudly as they consumed the wood. I hoped the light and noise would deter any curious animals or people. But as darkness fell, the unease returned, stronger than ever. I sat by the fire, my eyes darting to the shadows beyond the clearing. The forest felt too quiet, the usual sounds muted. I tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept drifting to the abandoned campsite I'd found. Had whoever been there experienced the same feelings? Had they left in a hurry because of it? Hours passed, and I fought the urge to retreat to my tent. The fire was my only comfort, its light pushing back the oppressive darkness. But eventually, I had to let it die down. I couldn't risk running out of wood before morning. As the flames dwindled, the shadows crept closer, and my unease turned to fear. Then I heard it again, the crunching of footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was deliberate, moving steadily toward the clearing. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the embers. I grabbed my flashlight, fumbling to turn it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A figure, barely visible, slipped between the trees. Panic set in. I shouted, my voice hoarse, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but it was tall and motionless, its presence unnerving. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the dying fire, clutching my flashlight and a small camping knife. The figure never approached, but I felt its eyes on me, unrelenting. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. My hands trembled as I worked, the thought of that figure lurking in the woods spurring me on. The hike back to my car was a blur. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the trees themselves were closing in. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was a welcome sight. I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors, my heart racing as I sped away. Even now, I can't explain what happened on that trip. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just another camper or a trick of the light. But deep down, I know it was something more. The feeling of being watched, the deliberate footsteps, the figure in the darkness. It all felt too real to ignore. I haven't been camping since. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now feel threatening. I've shared my story with a few friends, but most just laugh it off, saying I let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe they're right, or maybe they've never felt the kind of fear that lingers long after you've left the forest behind. I had always enjoyed solo camping trips. There was something about being out there, away from everything, that made me feel alive. My plan this time was to hike deep into the wilderness of northern Montana and spend a week completely off the grid. I'd planned it carefully, mapping out my route and packing everything I thought I'd need. I had my tent, food for 7 days, extra layers, a first aid kit, and my trusty GPS, along with a paper map and compass as backups. I'd even alerted a friend about my itinerary, just in case something went wrong. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived. The sun was just rising, casting golden light over the dense pine forest. I shouldered my pack, locked my car, and headed off. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. Birds chirped in the trees, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. The air was cool and crisp, and I felt strong as I climbed steadily higher into the mountains. By midday, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break. I sat on a rock, pulled out some trail mix, and drank from my water bottle. The view was stunning, endless rows of forested hills stretching out to the horizon. It felt good to be alone, surrounded by nature, with no phone notifications or city noise to distract me. The first night passed without incident. I set up my tent near a small stream and cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove. The sound of the water flowing nearby was soothing, and I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hike. I woke up with the sun the next morning, feeling refreshed and ready to tackle another day of hiking deeper into the backcountry. The second day was tougher. The trail grew steeper and less defined. In some places, it disappeared altogether, forcing me to rely on my map and compass. The terrain was rough, with large boulders and fallen trees blocking my path. I had to scramble over rocks and duck under branches, which slowed my pace considerably. By late afternoon, my legs were burning, and I still hadn't found a good spot to set up camp. Eventually, I came across a flat patch of ground near a ridge. It wasn't ideal, there was no water source nearby, but it would have to do. I pitched my tent and made a quick dinner before the sun dipped below the horizon. The temperature dropped sharply, and I was grateful for my warm sleeping bag. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling outside the tent. I froze, straining to listen. My first thought was that it might be an animal. I'd seen signs of wildlife during the hike, deer tracks, a couple of bear scat piles, so it wasn't out of the question. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The beam of light illuminated the trees, but I didn't see anything unusual. The rustling stopped, and after a while, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind or a small critter. Still, I kept my bear spray within arm's reach for the rest of the night. The third day brought more challenges. The trail became even harder to follow, and I had to backtrack several times after realizing I'd gone the wrong way. By the time I reached a small lake where I'd planned to camp, I was thoroughly exhausted. The lake was beautiful, though, with crystal clear water reflecting the surrounding mountains. I set up camp on the shore and spent some time filtering water and washing up. It felt good to clean off the grime from the hike. That night, the unease returned. This time, it wasn't just rustling. I heard what sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as I lay still, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to circle the tent, pausing every so often. I gripped my bear spray tightly, my mind racing through possibilities. Could it be a bear? But bears don't usually act like that, and I'd taken all the proper precautions with my food. The footsteps eventually faded away, but I didn't sleep much after that. When morning came, I packed up quickly and decided to move on. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, though, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just spooking myself, but it didn't help. On the fourth day, I decided to change my route. I'd originally planned to loop back around and take a different trail out, but now I just wanted to get back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. I spent most of the day hiking at a brisk pace, barely stopping to eat or rest. The forest felt different now, less inviting, more oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. Late in the afternoon, I came across something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing, I found a campsite, or what was left of one. There was a torn tent, its poles bent and broken, and scattered gear. It didn't look like it had been there long. The damage could have been caused by a bear, but there were no claw marks or other signs of an animal attack. It looked more like someone had trashed the place deliberately. My gut told me to get out of there as fast as possible. I pushed on, even though I was tired and the sun was starting to set. I didn't want to camp anywhere near that site. Eventually, I found a spot near a rocky outcrop that seemed relatively safe. I didn't bother with a fire or cooking dinner. I just ate a protein bar and crawled into my tent. I kept my bear spray and a knife close at hand and tried to sleep, but every noise outside kept me on edge. The fifth day was a blur. I was completely focused on getting back to the trailhead. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier with every step, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of the woods. Around midday, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Fresh footprints heading in the same direction as me. They were large, made by boots, and they hadn't been there when I passed through this area before. Someone was ahead of me on the trail. I quickened my pace, hoping to catch up to whoever it was. Maybe they'd seen something, or maybe they could help me figure out what was going on. But as the hours passed and I didn't see anyone, my anxiety grew. The footprints veered off the trail at one point, disappearing into the forest. I kept going, not wanting to follow them. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon. My car was still there, untouched, and I've never been so relieved to see it. I tossed my pack in the trunk and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine and pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, weeks later, the experience haunts me. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm not sure I'll ever go camping alone again. Camping alone was always something I thought of as a rite of passage. I'd read stories and seen movies about people heading out into the wilderness, confronting nature, and coming back with a new perspective on life. It wasn't that I was trying to prove anything to anyone else. I just wanted to know if I could handle it. So one summer, I packed my gear and drove out to a state forest a few hours away from home. It was a place I'd heard about from friends, off the beaten path, but not so remote that it felt dangerous. The parking lot at the trailhead was nearly empty when I arrived. There was an old sedan and a beat-up pickup truck parked near the entrance, but no sign of their owners. I glanced at the trail map nailed to a wooden post, mentally marking the loops and landmarks. My plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles into the woods, find a clearing to set up camp, and spend 2 nights there. Then I'd hike back the same way. It sounded easy enough. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The trail was well maintained, winding through dense trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. Birds chirped above, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't completely alone. I stopped a few times to drink water and adjust my pack, but mostly I kept moving, eager to get to my campsite before the sun started to set. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near a creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of space for my tent, and close enough to the water for convenience. I set down my pack and started unpacking. First, I pitched my tent, taking care to anchor it securely. Then I gathered some rocks to create a fire ring. By the time I'd finished, the shadows were growing longer, and the air had a noticeable chill. After collecting enough firewood to last the evening, I sat down to eat a simple meal. The quiet was both calming and unnerving. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had me glancing over my shoulder. It was amazing how, even in a place as serene as this, my mind could conjure up imaginary threats. I told myself it was just the natural anxiety of being alone in an unfamiliar place. As darkness fell, I lit a small fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. I tried to read for a while, but the flickering light made it hard to focus. Instead, I leaned back against a log and stared into the fire, letting my mind wander. The sounds of the forest seemed louder at night. The chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, the occasional splash from the creek. It all felt amplified in the darkness. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it. A distinct snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up straight, my heart racing. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. I strained my ears, trying to determine where the sound had come from. It was hard to tell. The dense forest seemed to echo every noise, making it impossible to pinpoint a source. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. I'd seen tracks on the trail earlier, and it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to roam at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After a while, the noises stopped, and I managed to convince myself it was nothing. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside seemed amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. When I woke, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden light through the trees. I felt a little silly for being so jumpy the night before. The forest looked so different in the daylight, almost welcoming. I decided to spend the day exploring the area, following the creek upstream to see where it led. The hike was uneventful but enjoyable. I found another, smaller clearing a little further up the trail and made a mental note of it in case I ever came back. By the time I returned to my campsite, it was late afternoon. I was tired but satisfied, looking forward to another quiet evening by the fire. That night, the unease returned. It started with the same snapping sounds I'd heard the night before. This time, they were closer. I sat by the fire, trying to keep calm, but my imagination was running wild. I'd read enough stories about people encountering strangers in the woods to know that it wasn't just animals I had to worry about. The thought made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, deliberate whistle. It was faint, but unmistakable. The kind of sound a person makes when they're trying to get someone's attention. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared into the darkness, trying to see anything beyond the glow of the fire. I grabbed the knife from my pack, clutching it tightly. The whistle came again, a little louder this time. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows shifting in the firelight. I told myself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was another camper, someone who'd gotten lost and was trying to signal for help. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about the sound felt off, too deliberate. The noises continued for what felt like hours. Soft rustling, the occasional snap of a twig, and that eerie whistle. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. Whatever or whoever had been out there was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. I packed up my campsite quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. As much as I wanted to convince myself that I was overreacting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally saw the parking lot, I nearly cried with relief. Both cars I'd seen when I arrived were gone, leaving only my own. I tossed my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. But the road behind me was empty. It wasn't until I was miles away that I started to feel safe again. Even now, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal or another camper who didn't realize how unsettling they were being. But part of me wonders if I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. Whatever the truth is, I know one thing for sure: I won't be camping alone again. It started as a simple idea, just me, a weekend in the wilderness, and a chance to reset my mind from the relentless grind of daily life. I chose a secluded spot in a national forest, about a 4-hour drive from home. The appeal was its remoteness. It was far enough from any town that I'd be unlikely to see another soul, which was exactly what I wanted. I'd packed my gear meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold temperatures, enough food and water for 3 days, a first aid kit, and all the essentials I'd need to stay comfortable and safe. The drive out was uneventful, and by early afternoon, I was pulling into a small dirt lot at the trailhead. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The trail stretched out in front of me, a narrow dirt path winding deeper into the woods. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I shouldered my pack and started walking, eager to put some distance between myself and the car. The hike in was tougher than I'd expected. The trail climbed steadily, and my pack seemed heavier with each step. The isolation was palpable. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist. After about 3 hours, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect. The ground was flat and soft, and the stream provided a constant supply of fresh water. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and built a small fire pit. By the time the sun began to set, I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the warmth as I ate a simple meal of dehydrated camping food. The first night passed uneventfully. The sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, lulled me to sleep. When I woke the next morning, the air was crisp and cool, the sun just beginning to filter through the trees. I spent the day exploring the area, following the stream upstream for a while, and marveling at the untouched beauty of the forest. It felt good to be disconnected, to have nothing to do but exist in the moment. It was on the second night that things began to feel off. As darkness fell and I sat by the fire, I became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The forest, which had been alive with sound the night before, seemed unnaturally quiet. The usual background noise, insects, birds, the occasional rustle of a small animal was absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, and forced myself to focus on the crackling fire and the stars overhead. But the feeling of unease persisted. As I climbed into my tent and zipped myself in, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. I'd positioned the tent so that the entrance faced the fire, and through the mesh window, I could see the faint glow of the embers. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at that glow, listening intently for any sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The fire had burned down to a few faintly glowing coals, and the interior of the tent was pitch black. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart began to pound. I lay completely still, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I reached for the flashlight I'd placed next to my sleeping bag and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. I hesitated for a moment before unzipping the door just enough to peek out. The forest was eerily still. The pale light of the moon cast long shadows across the clearing. I swept the flashlight beam around but saw nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone or anything. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I zipped the tent back up and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent to find a disturbing sight. Around the perimeter of my campsite, the ground was disturbed. The leaves and dirt had been kicked up, as if someone had walked in circles around my tent. I crouched down to inspect the marks more closely. They weren't hoof prints or paw prints, they were footprints. Bare human footprints. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around my campsite while I slept. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I'd spent so much time planning this trip, and I wasn't ready to let some creepy footprints ruin it. I decided to stay, but to keep my guard up. I spent the day close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping a sharp eye out for anything unusual. I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, and by evening, I'd almost convinced myself that the footprints were old, that they'd been there before I arrived and I just overlooked them. That night, I built the fire bigger and brighter than before. I sat close to it, my back to the tent, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to have regained some of its usual sounds, and the normalcy was comforting. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the fire died down, I reluctantly climbed into the tent, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the campsite. My pulse raced as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I turned it on, the footsteps stopped. I unzipped the tent and shone the beam into the darkness. Nothing. The forest was still. But as I turned the flashlight off and lay back down, the footsteps resumed. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my knife from my pack and stepped out of the tent. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I scanned the clearing. The moonlight illuminated the campsite just enough for me to see the faint outline of a figure standing at the edge of the trees. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. I froze, gripping the knife tightly, unsure of what to do. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to the car. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. When I finally reached the car, I tossed my pack into the back seat and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but the unease lingered. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about that trip. I've told myself it was just some harmless wanderer, maybe another camper who stumbled upon my site by accident. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whoever it was, they were watching me, following me, waiting for something. I've gone camping since, but I've never returned to that forest, and I don't think I ever will. I had always loved the solitude of the outdoors. Something about being surrounded by trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the scent of pine made me feel grounded. So when I finally got a weekend off work, I decided to head out on a solo camping trip to a place I'd been meaning to explore for years, a secluded forest about 2 hours outside of town. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was exactly what I wanted. The fewer people, the better. I packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. I even threw in a small knife and some paracord just in case. The drive out was peaceful, the roads empty, and the landscape gradually shifting from urban sprawl to rolling hills and dense woods. By the time I reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the dirt parking lot. There was only one other car there, an old sedan covered in dust. It didn't look like anyone had been around for a while. I shrugged it off and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. The trail started out wide and well-maintained, cutting through a field before disappearing into the trees. As I walked, I felt the tension of the week melt away. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise and stress of everyday life. After about an hour of hiking, I reached a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, surrounded by trees, and not too far from a creek where I could refill my water bottles if needed. I pitched my tent quickly, taking care to smooth out the ground underneath so I wouldn't be lying on any rocks or roots. Then I gathered some wood for a fire, stacking it neatly in a ring of stones someone had left behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire and sat back to enjoy the warmth. Dinner was simple, just a can of soup heated over the flames, but it tasted better than anything I'd eaten in weeks. Afterward, I stretched out in my chair, staring up at the sky. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them, a reminder of how far I was from the city lights. Eventually, the fire burned low, and I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and burrowed into my sleeping bag. The quiet was almost overwhelming at first, but exhaustion soon took over, and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest was dark and silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush nearby. My first thought was that it was an animal. Deer, raccoons, even bears were common in this area. But as I lay there, holding my breath, the sound didn't seem to match any of those. It wasn't the random scuffle of an animal foraging for food. It was deliberate, like footsteps. I told myself it was probably just my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen, or the wind was stirring the leaves. But the sound didn't go away. If anything, it got closer. My heart started to pound, and I cursed myself for not bringing something more substantial for protection. The knife in my pack suddenly felt woefully inadequate. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look outside or stay hidden and hope whoever or whatever it was would move on. Before I could decide, the sound stopped. The silence was even worse. I strained my ears, trying to catch any hint of movement, but there was nothing. Just as I started to convince myself it had been a deer after all, I heard a new sound, a faint tapping, like someone was drumming their fingers on a hard surface. It was coming from the direction of the fire pit. My blood ran cold. I hadn't left anything out there that could make that noise. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound. My hand shook as I clicked it on and aimed the beam at the tent flap. The thin fabric glowed faintly, but I couldn't see anything beyond it. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the flap just enough to peek outside. The fire pit was empty. The clearing looked exactly as I'd left it, with no sign of anyone or anything. But the tapping sound continued, now coming from just beyond the circle of trees. I swept the flashlight beam in that direction, but it only illuminated more darkness. My mind raced. If it was a person, why weren't they saying anything? Why would they be out here in the middle of nowhere, messing around in the dark? I ducked back inside the tent and zipped it up all the way. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool night air. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat there clutching the flashlight and the knife, jumping at every little sound. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept into the tent, and I felt a wave of relief. When I finally emerged, the clearing looked completely normal. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I told myself I must have imagined it. Maybe I'd been more tired than I realized, and my mind had played tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to cut my trip short. After packing up my gear, I started back down the trail. The hike out felt different. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and realized how quiet it was. The birds, which had been chirping cheerfully the day before, were silent. Even the wind seemed to have died down. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. The other car, the dusty sedan, was gone. I didn't remember hearing anyone leave, but I was too eager to get out of there to dwell on it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the trailhead disappear behind me. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I've been on plenty of camping trips since then, but I've never gone back to that spot. I don't know what I heard that night, and part of me doesn't want to know. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I'll hear a faint tapping sound and feel that same prickling fear. I've told myself it's nothing, just the house settling or a branch against the window. But deep down, I'm not so sure. I always enjoyed camping. There was something about being away from everything. The noise of the city, the constant buzz of my phone, and the artificial light that seemed to seep into every corner of life. Being surrounded by trees, the smell of pine, and the sounds of nature felt like a reset button for my mind. But this trip would remind me that nature isn't always serene. The plan was simple. I'd take a 3-day solo camping trip to a remote part of the state. The area was known for its challenging hiking trails and scenic views, and I had researched it extensively. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and spend some time alone with my thoughts. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and a small knife. Everything seemed perfect. The trailhead was nearly 2 hours away by car. I parked in a small gravel lot at the base of the mountain. The air was crisp, and the sun filtered through the trees as I tightened the straps on my backpack and headed up the trail. The first day was uneventful. I followed the marked path, occasionally stopping to take in the views. There were no other hikers around, which wasn't surprising given how remote the location was. By late afternoon, I found a suitable spot to set up camp, a flat patch of ground near a small stream. I pitched my tent, gathered some wood for a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The evening was peaceful, and I spent some time reading a book before crawling into my sleeping bag. The gentle sounds of the forest lulled me to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, eager to tackle a more challenging section of the trail. I packed up my camp and set off. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, with loose rocks and narrow passages. My legs ached as I climbed higher, but the views were worth it. I reached a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. I sat there for a while, eating a snack and letting the wind cool my sweaty skin. As the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. Small things at first, a broken branch here, a patch of disturbed dirt there. I shrugged it off, attributing it to wildlife. But as I continued, I felt an odd sensation, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. By the time I found a spot to camp for the night, I was exhausted. The unease I'd felt earlier seemed to fade as I focused on setting up my tent and cooking dinner. The fire crackled, and I stared into the flames, letting my mind wander. When the fire died down, I crawled into my tent, ready for another night of restful sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest seemed louder that night. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were accompanied by something else. Faint, irregular noises that didn't belong. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to ignore it. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke with a start sometime in the middle of the night. My heart was pounding, and it took me a moment to realize what had woken me. There was a noise outside my tent, close enough that I could hear it clearly. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be an animal. I froze, my mind racing. Was it another hiker? But why would someone be out here in the middle of the night? The footsteps circled my tent, pausing occasionally. I lay there, barely breathing, gripping the small knife I'd kept within reach. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. Minutes passed, then an hour, but I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke, it was dawn. I unzipped my tent cautiously, peering outside. There was no one there, but the ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints, human footprints. My stomach sank as I stared at them. They were large, definitely a man's, and they circled my tent several times before disappearing into the trees. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and head back to the car, but the trail back was long, and I'd have to hike most of the day to get there. I decided to stick to my plan, telling myself it was probably just another camper who had stumbled across my site. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I spent the day hiking, but my enjoyment was dampened by paranoia. I kept checking over my shoulder, listening for any unusual sounds. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched persisted. By late afternoon, I found another spot to set up camp, this time choosing a location further off the trail and more concealed by trees. That night, I didn't light a fire. I ate a cold meal and sat in the dark, listening to the forest. The usual sounds were there, but so were the faint, irregular noises I'd heard the night before. I stayed awake as long as I could, clutching my knife and straining my ears. At some point, exhaustion overtook me again. I woke suddenly to the sound of something scraping against my tent. My heart leapt into my throat as I lay there, gripping my knife. The scraping stopped, replaced by the sound of breathing. Deep, heavy breaths, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I've never felt fear like that before, a paralyzing terror that made it hard to think. I knew I had to do something, but what? Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on and shining it towards the sound. The breathing stopped, and there was a moment of silence before I heard rapid footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't dare leave the tent. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the knife and flashlight, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent, my legs shaky. The ground outside was disturbed again, more footprints circling my tent. But this time there was something else. Deep gouges in the fabric of the tent, where the scraping had come from. Whoever it was had used something sharp, maybe a knife or a tool. My stomach churned as I stared at the marks. I packed up quickly, deciding to cut the trip short. I couldn't stay out here another night. The hike back to the car was grueling, my legs weak from lack of sleep and adrenaline. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me, but the trail was empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief. But as I approached my car, I noticed something that made my heart sink. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it with trembling hands. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 3 words: "You were lucky. I didn't stick around to think about it." I threw my gear into the car and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I haven't been camping since. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now feel like a reminder that not everything out there is friendly. I don't know who is out there with me or what they wanted, but I'm not eager to find out. Some places are better left alone. I had always loved the idea of getting away from everything. The noise of the city, the endless notifications, and the constant hum of life that felt like it never stopped. So, when a long weekend came around, I decided it was the perfect chance to head out into the wilderness for a solo camping trip. I'd done it before, and while it wasn't always easy, it was something I looked forward to. The silence of the forest and the simplicity of living with just the basics felt like a reset button for my brain. This time, I chose a less popular spot. I wanted solitude, and I'd read about a remote trail in a forum online. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods, with a small, secluded lake about 10 miles in. It sounded perfect. I packed my gear: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, and a few other essentials. I also made sure to pack my knife and bear spray just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but being prepared gave me peace of mind. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful but long. The road narrowed the closer I got, eventually turning into a gravel path that wound through the forest. By the time I parked my car at the small dirt lot, it was already mid-afternoon. There were no other cars there, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I double-checked my map and set off, the weight of my pack pressing comfortably against my back. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push aside branches and step over roots, but it was beautiful. The trees were tall and old, their thick trunks covered in moss. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy smell of the forest. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant sound of a bird or the rustling of leaves as a squirrel darted through the underbrush. It felt like I was walking into a world untouched by humans. After about 4 hours of hiking, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I'd imagined, but still stunning. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom near the shore. Tall pines surrounded it, their reflections rippling on the surface. I found a flat spot near the edge of the water and set up my camp. The ground was soft but firm enough to hold the stakes of my tent. Once everything was ready, I sat on a rock by the water and ate a simple dinner of trail mix and jerky. The quiet was almost unsettling at first, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire. The crackling flames and the warmth were comforting as the temperature dropped. I stayed up for a while, staring into the fire and letting my mind wander. When I finally crawled into my tent, it was completely dark outside. I zipped up the tent flap and lay down, listening to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had gone out, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the tent fabric. I listened, straining to hear anything unusual, but the forest was silent. Too silent. The usual background noise of insects and distant rustling was gone. It was the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I grabbed my knife and bear spray and placed them within arm's reach before lying back down. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the lake. I left my tent and most of my gear behind, taking only my day pack with some snacks, water, and a map. The trail around the lake was faint, more of a game trail than anything meant for humans, but it was manageable. I walked slowly, taking in the scenery and enjoying the stillness. But as I made my way around the lake, I started noticing things that felt out of place. The first was a pile of rocks stacked neatly near the base of a tree. It wasn't the kind of thing nature would do on its own. It looked deliberate, almost like a marker. A little further on, I found what looked like a piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was dark and weathered, but it didn't look like it had been there long. I told myself it was probably from another hiker, though I hadn't seen any signs of recent activity. As I continued, the feeling of being watched crept over me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the forest was empty. Or at least it seemed that way. The dense trees made it hard to see far, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on the beauty of the place. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was high in the sky, and the feeling had mostly passed. That evening, I decided to fish. I'd brought a small collapsible rod and some bait, and I'd seen plenty of fish jumping in the lake. I sat by the water, casting my line and enjoying the peacefulness. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I caught a couple of small fish, enough for dinner, and cooked them over the fire. They tasted incredible, the smoky flavor from the fire adding to their freshness. As darkness fell, I felt more at ease than I had the night before. The sounds of the forest were back, and the firelight created a cozy bubble of warmth. I stayed up later, letting the fire burn down to embers before finally crawling into my tent. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, it wasn't silence that woke me. It was a sound. At first, I couldn't place it. It was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves, but more deliberate. I lay there, holding my breath and listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It was the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe, but the steps sounded too heavy for a deer or a raccoon. A bear? Unlikely, given how cautious they usually were around humans. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my knife and bear spray. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The seconds stretched into minutes as I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the steps moved away, fading into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my knife and listening for any sign of movement. None came. When morning finally arrived, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find signs of whatever had been there. But the campsite looked undisturbed. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the car. Packing up took less than an hour. I double-checked to make sure I hadn't left anything behind and started back down the trail. The hike out felt different. The forest, which had seemed peaceful and inviting when I arrived, now felt oppressive. The trees seemed closer, their shadows darker. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. About halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made my blood run cold. A fresh footprint in the dirt. It was a boot print, larger than mine, and headed in the same direction I was going. I stopped, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone the entire trip, and the thought that someone else was out here, possibly following me, was terrifying. I picked up my pace, practically jogging at times, but I was careful not to make too much noise. The last thing I wanted was to alert whoever it was that I'd seen their tracks. The trail seemed longer on the way back, every twist and turn dragging out my anxiety. When I finally saw the parking lot through the trees, relief washed over me. But as I stepped into the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. My car's driver's side door was open. I hadn't left it that way. I was sure of it. I'd locked the car before I set off. Slowly, I approached, my knife in one hand and bear spray in the other. The inside of the car was a mess. My glove compartment was open, and the contents were scattered across the seats. A couple of empty water bottles lay on the floor, but nothing seemed to be missing. It looked more like someone had been searching for something. I didn't waste any time. I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty lot and the dense forest beyond. The drive back to civilization felt like it took forever. I kept checking my mirrors, my mind replaying every strange moment of the trip. By the time I reached home, the tension in my body had turned into exhaustion. I locked every door and window, double-checked them, and then collapsed onto my couch, unable to shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I didn't fully understand. I never went back to that trail. In fact, I haven't been camping alone since. The wilderness still calls to me, but now I'm more cautious. Whatever happened out there, it reminded me that the forest isn't just a place of peace and beauty. It's also a place where you're completely alone, where help is miles away, and where sometimes the scariest thing isn't the wildlife or the elements. It's other people. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. It had been a while since I'd had any real time to myself, and the idea of getting away from the noise and stress of daily life was too tempting to pass up. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and plenty of water. I even bought a new pair of hiking boots to break in. My destination was a remote area deep in the mountains, a place I had read about but never visited. It was supposed to be peaceful and secluded, perfect for a little solitude. The drive to the trailhead took longer than I expected. Winding mountain roads, sharp turns, and a lack of cell service made me realize just how far I was from civilization. When I finally arrived, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. I parked my car, double-checked my supplies, and started down the trail. The first hour was uneventful. The trail was well-marked, and the scenery was breathtaking. Towering pine trees lined the path, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, fragrant layer. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint sound of a distant stream. I felt a sense of calm settle over me as I walked deeper into the wilderness. This was exactly what I had hoped for. As I hiked, I noticed the trail becoming narrower and less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. The light was fading fast, and I realized I needed to find a spot to set up camp before it got too dark. I veered off the trail slightly, searching for a flat, open area. After a few minutes, I found a small clearing surrounded by trees. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. Setting up the tent took longer than it should have. The ground was uneven, and I struggled to drive the stakes into the rocky soil. By the time I finished, the last light of day had disappeared, leaving me in near total darkness. I turned on my headlamp and unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. The small beam of light felt feeble against the vast blackness around me. I tried not to think about how isolated I was. After a quick dinner of trail mix and jerky, I climbed into the tent and zipped it shut. The silence was almost oppressive. I could hear every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals, but my imagination ran wild. The sounds seemed to grow louder as the night went on. I tried to focus on the reason I was there, to relax, to disconnect, but it was hard to shake the feeling of vulnerability. The next morning, I woke early. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, and the forest seemed less intimidating in the daylight. I decided to explore the area a bit before heading further down the trail. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, and a map, and set off in the direction of a nearby ridge I had spotted on my map. The climb was steep, but the view from the top was worth it. The landscape stretched out before me, an endless sea of green punctuated by jagged peaks. It was breathtaking. As I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something odd in the distance. A thin column of smoke rose above the trees, too far away to make out any details. My first thought was that it might be another camper, but the smoke seemed wrong somehow. It was too thin, too steady. I decided to ignore it and headed back to my campsite. There was no need to let my mind play tricks on me. When I returned to the campsite, I noticed something was off. My tent was still standing, but the flap was unzipped. I was certain I had closed it before leaving. I approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of disturbance. Inside, everything seemed untouched. My gear was where I had left it, and nothing appeared to be missing. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself it was probably just the wind or my own forgetfulness. That night, the sounds outside the tent seemed louder than before. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining to identify each noise. There were the usual rustles and snaps, but then I heard something else, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in place. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I waited, barely breathing, until I finally worked up the courage to peek out of the tent. The forest was dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon. I saw nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I climbed back into my sleeping bag and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. The solitude I had been craving now felt oppressive, and the thought of spending another night out here was unbearable. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to get back to the trailhead and the safety of my car. As I hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I would hear a rustle behind me or catch a fleeting shadow out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my pace quickened all the same. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief. My car was just where I had left it, and the sight of it filled me with a sense of safety I hadn't realized I was missing. I loaded my gear into the trunk and started the engine, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and the forest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, partially obscured by the shadows. They didn't move, didn't try to follow me. They just stood there, watching. I kept driving, my heart pounding, until the forest was far behind me. I never went back to that area, and I never told anyone about what happened. Even now, I'm not sure what I saw or heard, but every so often, when I'm alone in a quiet place, I hear that faint, rhythmic thumping in the back of my mind, and I remember the feeling of being watched, the unmistakable certainty that I wasn't alone out there. I've always been someone who loves camping. The quiet of the wilderness, the absence of cell service, and the simplicity of living out of a backpack all appeal to me. So when I found a remote spot in the national forest that barely anyone seemed to visit, I jumped at the chance to spend a weekend there alone. It was a few hours' drive from where I lived, and the trailhead was tucked away on an unmarked dirt road. The remoteness was part of the charm. I packed my gear with care: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, food, a small cooking stove, flashlight, and some other essentials. I also brought along a map and compass, even though I had a GPS watch, because I'm not one to rely solely on technology. The weather forecast was clear, and I was eager to escape the buzz of daily life. The hike to the campsite was about 8 miles, mostly uphill. The trail wasn't well maintained, and at times, it was little more than a faint path winding through the trees. I enjoyed the challenge, though. The first few hours were peaceful, with nothing but the sound of birds and the crunch of my boots on the trail. Occasionally, I'd see deer darting through the underbrush or hear the rustling of small animals. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The spot I chose was near a small, clear stream, surrounded by tall pines and a few scattered boulders. It was perfect, quiet, isolated, and with just enough flat ground for my tent. I set up quickly, wanting to get everything organized before dark. Once the tent was up, I gathered some wood to build a small fire. Even though I didn't plan on keeping it going long, it added a sense of comfort. After eating a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky, I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The stars began to appear one by one, and soon the sky was a canvas of constellations. It was the kind of night that makes you feel small, but in a good way. I stayed up for a while, listening to the distant hoots of owls and the soft murmur of the stream. Eventually, though, the chill set in and I decided to call it a night. Inside my tent, I felt safe. The thin walls of nylon might not have been much of a barrier, but they created a sense of separation from the vastness outside. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and drifted off to sleep, feeling content. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of my tent, listening. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. I could hear the faint gurgle of the stream and the occasional rustling of leaves. Figuring it was just a deer or some other harmless animal, I tried to go back to sleep. But then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. My mind immediately went to animals again, a bear, maybe, or a raccoon. But as I lay there, the sound grew louder and more deliberate. It wasn't the random noise of an animal foraging. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. My heart started to race. I told myself it had to be my imagination or some natural explanation, but the sound continued. It was coming closer, moving through the woods toward my campsite. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I stared at the tent wall, half expecting to see a shadow or movement. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it a hiker who had gotten lost? Park ranger? But what kind of person would be wandering through the woods at this hour without a flashlight? Minutes passed, and the silence was deafening. I thought whoever or whatever it was had moved on, but then I heard a faint, scraping sound. It was right next to my tent, as if someone was dragging a stick or blade against the fabric. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. My backpack was next to me, and I carefully reached for the knife I always kept in the side pocket. My fingers found the handle, and I gripped it tightly. The scraping stopped, and everything went quiet again. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't hear any footsteps retreating, but I also didn't hear anything else. After what felt like an eternity, I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The campsite was empty. The fire had long since died down, and the moonlight barely illuminated the trees. I scanned the area, knife in hand, but saw no signs of anyone. Slowly, I unzipped the tent further and stepped out. The cool air hit me, and I felt exposed without the flimsy walls of the tent around me. I checked the ground for tracks but couldn't find anything definitive. The forest floor was a mix of leaves and pine needles, making it hard to tell if anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I debated whether to pack up and hike back to the trailhead, but the thought of navigating the narrow, uneven trail in the dark wasn't appealing. Reluctantly, I decided to stay until morning. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat in my tent with my knife in hand, listening to every sound the forest made. The footsteps didn't return, and eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough to see clearly, I packed up my gear and started the hike back. The hike out was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone had been watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear in the trunk, started the engine, and didn't look back. It wasn't until I got home and unpacked that I noticed something strange. The tent's rainfly had a small, clean cut in it. Not a tear, but a deliberate slice. I hadn't noticed it while I was out there, but now it was impossible to ignore. Someone had been at my campsite that night, and they had been close enough to touch my tent. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some prankster trying to scare me, or maybe it was something more sinister. Either way, I haven't been camping alone since. The wilderness might be beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes it's not the animals you need to worry about. It started out as a typical solo camping trip. I've always been someone who enjoys the quiet of nature, the feeling of being disconnected from the chaos of everyday life and just soaking in the solitude. This time, I decided to head out to a remote area in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but I'd picked a location that was a little more off the beaten path than usual. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The hike to the campsite was long but beautiful. The trail wound through dense forests, crossed a few creeks, and climbed steep ridges. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. By the time I reached the spot I'd planned to set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I quickly pitched my tent in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and started a fire. As the night settled in, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and staring up at the stars. The silence was profound, only broken by the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. It was the kind of peace I'd been craving. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep, feeling content and safe. The first night passed uneventfully, and I woke up to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. I spent the day exploring the area, hiking further into the wilderness. I came across a small stream where I refilled my water bottles, and I even spotted a deer grazing in a meadow. It felt like I was the only person in the world, and I loved it. That evening, as I returned to my campsite, I noticed something odd. A small pile of rocks had been arranged near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't there when I left in the morning. At first, I thought it might have been animals, though I'd never seen anything like it before. Still, I didn't dwell on it too much. I'd read stories about hikers leaving markers or cairns, so maybe someone else had passed through while I was out. The second night, things started to feel different. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of being alone in such a remote place. But every now and then, I'd hear faint rustling in the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I'd shine my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but I never saw anything. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just animals and went to bed. I didn't sleep well that night, I kept waking up to sounds outside my tent. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I thought I heard soft footsteps circling the tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sounds stopped as suddenly as they started. When morning finally came, I was relieved. The next day, I decided to stay closer to my campsite. I wasn't ready to pack up and leave just yet, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I spent the day gathering firewood, making sure I had enough to keep the fire going all night. I also double-checked my gear, making sure everything was in order. As the day wore on, the forest seemed quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath. That evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I felt the unease creeping back in. I made a point of keeping the fire large and bright, hoping it would deter any curious animals or people. But as the night deepened, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. This time, it wasn't just a vague sense of unease. It was a gnawing certainty that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I heard it again, the soft rustling, the snapping of twigs. But this time, it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam of light revealed nothing but shadows. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response. The sounds stopped, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, listening to every sound. At some point, I thought I heard faint breathing coming from the darkness, but I couldn't be sure. The hours dragged on, and I kept the fire burning as brightly as I could. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I decided to cut my trip short. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly scanning the forest around me. As I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another pile of rocks had appeared overnight, this time right next to the fire pit. It wasn't there when I went to bed. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just days ago, now felt menacing. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. The hike back was grueling. My legs felt heavy, and my heart pounded in my chest. I tried to stay focused on the trail, but my mind kept racing. Who had made those rock piles? Were they watching me now? The paranoia was overwhelming. About halfway back, I came across a section of the trail that had been blocked by a large branch. It hadn't been there on the way in. I had to climb over it to continue, and as I did, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Scratched into the bark of a nearby tree was a simple, chilling message. Go back. I didn't stop to think. I practically ran the rest of the way to the trailhead, my pack bouncing against my back. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and sped off without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away that I started to feel a sense of relief. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened on that trip. I've replayed it over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe someone really didn't want me there. Whatever the case, it's an experience I'll never forget. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure if I ever will again. I've always loved the idea of camping, disconnecting from the world, being surrounded by nature, and finding some peace in the wild. That's why I planned a weekend trip to a remote area of the national forest. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowded campgrounds or noisy groups, just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. I packed everything carefully: a sturdy tent, plenty of water, food, a first aid kit, and a small knife. I even brought a GPS device just in case I lost the trail. I'd chosen a spot that wasn't far from a small creek, thinking the sound of running water would be relaxing. The hike to the site wasn't too challenging, but it was long enough to feel like I was truly getting away from civilization. The forest was beautiful. Towering pines stretched high above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air smelled fresh, mixed with the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of light and shadow on the forest floor. Occasionally, I'd spot a squirrel darting up a tree or hear the call of a bird somewhere in the distance. It was everything I had hoped for. When I reached my chosen campsite, I felt a sense of satisfaction. The spot was perfect. Flat ground for the tent, a fire ring someone else had built long ago, and the creek just a short walk away. I set up my tent first, making sure it was secure. Then I gathered some wood for a fire and got everything organized. By the time I was done, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting the forest in a warm golden light. I sat by the fire that evening, eating a simple meal of canned beans and jerky. The crackling flames and the gentle murmur of the creek were the only sounds. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd been looking for. As the sky darkened and the stars came out, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The world felt far away, and for once I wasn't thinking about work, emails, or deadlines. It was just me and the forest. That first night I slept well. The sounds of the forest were like a lullaby. I woke up early the next morning, feeling refreshed. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I didn't go far, just followed the creek for a while and then looped back toward my campsite. Along the way, I found an old tree with deep claw marks on its trunk. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone out here. Bears or other wildlife could be nearby, but I wasn't too worried. I'd taken all the necessary precautions, like storing my food in a bear-proof container. The rest of the day was uneventful. I read a book by the fire, went for another short walk, and simply enjoyed being in the moment. As the sun began to set, I prepared for another quiet night. The forest seemed a little darker this time, the shadows deeper. I told myself it was just my imagination. Nights in the woods can play tricks on your mind if you let them. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy. I stayed still, listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My heart started to race. I reminded myself it could be anything. A deer, a raccoon, even just the wind. But the sound didn't go away. It moved, slow and deliberate, circling the edge of my campsite. I stayed in my tent, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the erratic movement of a small animal. It was steady, purposeful. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a bear? Or maybe another person? That thought was more unsettling than the idea of a wild animal. I waited, barely breathing, until the sound eventually faded away. Even then, I didn't relax. I stayed awake for hours, listening, until exhaustion finally pulled me back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent cautiously. The campsite looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. I checked the ground and found tracks near the edge of the clearing. They weren't from a bear or a deer. They looked human, barefoot. A chill ran down my spine. Who would be out here walking around barefoot in the middle of the night? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had gotten lost or was camping nearby. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. This area was remote. I hadn't seen a single person since I left the trailhead. I decided to stay alert but not let it ruin my trip. I spent the day close to camp, gathering more firewood and keeping myself busy. By evening, I felt a little more at ease. The tracks could have been old, I told myself. Maybe I hadn't noticed them before. That night, I built the fire bigger than usual, hoping it would deter any curious animals or people. I stayed up late, staring into the flames and listening to the forest. For a while, everything was quiet. Then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. The rustling. This time, it was closer, just beyond the glow of the firelight. My heart pounded as I strained to see into the darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows on the trees, making it hard to tell what was real. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The rustling stopped, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving. I stayed by the fire, gripping my knife, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When morning came, I made a decision. I was done. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. The forest felt different now, less inviting. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me. The hike back to the trailhead was tense. I moved as quickly as I could without breaking into a run, constantly scanning the trees around me. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I didn't stop to rest until I reached my car. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I felt a wave of relief. I was safe. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly avoided something. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know I'll never go back to that part of the forest again. Camping is supposed to be about finding peace in nature, but sometimes the wild reminds you that it's not always a place of solitude. Sometimes it's a place where you're not alone, and that's not always a good thing. I've always loved camping, and being outdoors has a way of resetting my mind. Last year, I planned a solo camping trip to a spot deep in the mountains. I had done some research and found a remote location that seemed perfect. No cell service, miles from any town, and surrounded by nature. The kind of place where you can't hear anything but the wind in the trees and the chirping of birds. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove out early in the morning, my car loaded with all the gear I'd need for a few days. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water, and the essentials like a flashlight, knife, and first aid kit. The drive took about 4 hours, and as I got closer, the roads became narrower and less maintained. By the time I reached the trailhead, it felt like I had left the world behind. There was only one other car in the small parking area, but it looked like it had been there for a while, covered in dirt and pine needles. That didn't bother me. In fact, it reassured me that I wouldn't run into anyone else out here. The hike to the campsite was about 6 miles, mostly uphill. The trail was overgrown in places, and I had to push through bushes and step over fallen branches. It was hard work, especially with my pack weighing me down, but the scenery made it worth it. The forest was dense, with tall pines and moss-covered rocks. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of small animals scurrying away as I passed, but otherwise it was quiet. I reached the spot I'd picked out from the map around mid-afternoon. It was a clearing near a small creek, with enough flat ground to set up my tent. The creek was shallow but clear, and I could hear the gentle sound of water flowing over the rocks. Felt perfect. I set up my tent quickly, then gathered some firewood for the evening. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. After dinner, I sat by the fire, enjoying the warmth as the temperature dropped. The stars came out, more than I'd ever seen in the city. I felt small under that vast sky, but also at peace. It was the kind of moment that made all the effort worth it. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of the creek. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A rustling sound, like something moving through the bushes near my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but then I heard a distinct crunch, the sound of a footstep on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. Animals don't usually make sounds like that. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the edge of the clearing. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling my campsite. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the tent's thin fabric. The beam of light didn't reveal anything, but the noise stopped. For a few minutes, everything was silent again except for the creek. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe just a raccoon or a fox, and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt near my tent. They were human footprints, barefoot and larger than mine. My stomach dropped. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here, especially not without shoes. I packed up my gear quickly, deciding to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the solitude, the idea of someone wandering around my campsite in the middle of the night was too unsettling. The hike back to the trailhead felt different. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful the day before, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty, and I didn't see or hear anyone else. When I finally reached the parking lot, my relief was short-lived. My car's driver's side window was smashed, and the inside was ransacked. Whoever had done it hadn't taken much, just some loose change and a flashlight I'd left in the glove compartment. But it was clear they'd been looking for something. The other car was still there, untouched. I reported the break-in to the local authorities when I got back to town, but there wasn't much they could do. The officer I spoke to said it wasn't uncommon for cars to be vandalized at remote trailheads. That didn't explain the footprints, though, or the fact that someone had been at my campsite in the middle of the night. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe the person who broke into my car had been camping nearby and stumbled across my site by accident. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Someone had been watching me, and they knew exactly where I was. I haven't been camping since,